locally disobedient media broadcasting on the worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. The Naked City, the city of 1,000 stories. It's a miserable night and traffic is miserable. So if you're blessed enough to be home tonight, listening to this show in the warm confines of your home, God bless you. If not, it's probably a really good time to find a spot at one of Providence's great restaurants and bars, and then annoy everybody by watching the show on your handheld device. CoalitionRadio.us, Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. Please follow us, please like us, and of course, this show and all other shows are placed on permanent review, if you will, at the YouTube page linked at the top of CoalitionRadio.us. A couple of quick editorial notes before we dive into tonight's subject. It appears that Channel 12, by all accounts, will be releasing polling data on the Paw Sox situation. This will be intriguing. I had the good fortune yesterday of spending quality time with Ted Nesi on the set of The Lively Experiment, which, through the miracle of tape delay and technology, you'll be able to see me twice tonight. Once if you're watching The Lively Experiment, and at the same time watching me here on the Coalition. Channel 12 has rapidly evolved into being Rhode Island's really only serious news station, and to the trio, if you will, of spot-on reporters, whether it be their Providence City reporter, whether it be Mr. White or Mr. Nesi, one can expect sober, intelligent coverage. My only hope is that when it comes to polling, they won't fall into the trap of, well, does everybody like the Paw Sox poll? Which is what Pawtucket Red Sox spent a year trying to convince Rhode Islanders, that simply liking them was worthy of a, who knows at this point, $50, $80, $100 million corporate cronyist support from a city and a state that is in deep financial trouble. So stay tuned. You can expect to have comments about that at Facebook.com/Coalition Radio. And of course, we've got our all apolitical, let's get a little bit more political, Billionaire Baseball Boys Club feed at Pawtucket is Home, where we will continue to issue comments on this until this episode, if you will, in the civic life of Rhode Islander is over, and until we finally realize that for-profit corporations should not be, if you will, looking for the taxpayers to support their lifestyles and their business. And they should not be placing taxpayer support in the form of picking winners and losers so that politically connected private corporations can triumph over the hardworking Rhode Islanders who have invested sweat equity, interminable hours, and operate at great financial risk to operate their own businesses. So let's get on to tonight's subject. I had the good fortune last Saturday evening of joining Liberty on the air at 11 o'clock on WRKO. We'll try and get that tape up at some point this week. It was great because it gave us the opportunity to begin to revisit a subject that Coalition Radio, when it was on AM radio, spent a great deal of time studying. And that, of course, is the legalization, the decriminalization, the role of sex work in society, and our government's reaction, our policing of, our rather contradictory attempts at prohibition of said activity. Obviously, this is a mature subject. Sexuality is. Very often, folks will use language with regarding this that, well, I can't cater to. Much like I find the concept of NIMBYism to be an obscenity, not in my backyard, to which I will always say, particularly in cases like Burrowville, whose backyard is it, the notion exists that folks who are discussing this will use this term victimless crime. Well, in many or if not most cases, there are no victims, and unless coercion is involved, it should never be a crime. Consensual activity between two adults is acceptable. People's expression of their sexuality is acceptable. Should there be a commercial element to that, I would expect people to really to understand that we commercialize a great deal of our interactions in society today. To those two individuals or more that's involved in that, Not only is it acceptable, it's appropriate, and quite frankly, it's their own private business. There's a hashtag that is prevalent out in the political world, if you will, of sex worker rights, and it's hashtag sex work is real work. It is real work, it's a profession, and we as a society need to, well, let's just say grow up, accept individual rights and individual self-ownership. Yes, it's a very libertarian concept, and allow people to engage in the type of relationships that they see fit. I'm fortunate enough today, through our research, to have come to, if you will, discussions with a number of organizations. You'll often refer in the media to an organization called SWAP, which is the Sex Workers Outreach Program. An organization operating in the Boston area operates effectively in partnership with SWAP. And it addresses, what's the term? A plethora of concerns, issues, whether it be civil rights, human rights, surrounding the lives of folks who are engaged in sex work. Of course, in this case, I'm talking about Massachusetts Sex Worker Ally Network, or otherwise known as MASWAN. They can be found on the web at massachusettsswan.org. And again, they can provide very often what our leadership here in Rhode Island, particularly given the events of the past week, are unable to, which is a intelligent, a mature, very oftentimes an academic perspective on the lives and the issues surrounding sex workers. So I'm privileged tonight to have a number of folks involved with that organization who operate in a variety of capacities are going to be joining us tonight. A number of folks have asked us to maintain a level of privacy. That's not a statement as to whether they're involved in sex work or if they're involved in the academic or involved in the support of sex work. It's merely a request, which of course we honor. Joining me first on the line for the very first time is Autumn. Autumn, welcome to the Coalition and thanks for joining us tonight.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So, first of all, maybe you can set the stage here. If you can give us a little background on the history of MASWAN, and also kind of paint a picture for us of the role it plays in all the issues we've already talked about. The politics, the legal issues, the social issues, the health concerns, the support issues surrounding the sex worker community.
Well, that's a big topic, but I can start with MASWAN. I'm in a pretty unique position to talk about it because I'm one of the founders.
Right.
I've been involved in the sex industry actually since I was a teenager. Mm-hmm. And my own narrative is a complicated one. But what's not complicated is the fact that, criminalization of the sex industry hurts all who are in it, mm-hmm. regardless of the level of choice, coercion, presence, and why they're working. Mm-hmm. So we formed MASWAN because, as those of us in the industry, it is incredibly hard to organize as sex workers. There are many aspects of what you would think be basic organizational tactics, support tactics that are criminalized, such as having a support group where we can talk to each other. That's something that is impeded by criminalization. So MASWAN was really a solution to this problem of having been forced underground due to legal status, where we needed a place where allies, the people who had our back, whether it's academics, whether it's just your average person who trusts us and believes us, for them to kind of organize and support us in what we needed. Because we can't always go to the State House and say, mm-hmm. I'm a sex worker and this legislation will hurt me. We can't do that. We risk everything. So MASWAN is really a group of people who can step up where we're prevented to.
Yeah, I want to stress too, what's important here is that the normal communication that would take place amongst individuals of any profession or of any background is often stunted here because, and please feel free to jump in where I'm wrong, but a simple conversation construed by an oppressive law enforcement authority can, in a sense, be criminalized in and of itself as conspiracy. There was a situation in our research in New Jersey where it was not even an economic activity. It was consensual activity amongst adults in the swinger community, where someone at a public nightclub simply announced on Facebook that an event was taking place. There was a cover charge to get into this nightclub, and because of those two combinations, the worker at the store, who was nothing more than the clerk with who was also put in charge of social media, was actually arrested, if you will, for conspiracy and for acting as organizing prostitution. So there wasn't even a real economic element to it. The cover charge was simply the cost of opening up the club at night. And yet, a hyperactive, over-aggressive law enforcement community attempted to criminalize what someone would say is just ordinary conversation. So that's the kind of veil you have to operate under. That's the cloud that your communications are.
No, that's exactly right. And what it does is create a situation where we're all isolated from each other and where our knowledge is isolated. Mm-hmm. So someone who is brand new to the industry has no way of learning the very basic things of how to protect ourselves, right. What screening process to use, how to judge a person's character, how to and even from a business perspective, the business advice, how to market, all of that information we can't share with each other. And when you keep people separate from each other, it makes it so easy for bad actors to prey on us. And that's bad actors in law enforcement, that's bad actors who are clients. I mean, even asking someone for advice, hey, I had this interaction with a client, what do you think? Can put them at risk for an aiding prostitution charge. Right. Or depending on the situation, in some states, some people can even get charged with aiding trafficking. Right. That's actually one of the concerns we have with having a support group. So we're going to get accused of aiding trafficking or aiding prostitution through giving emotional and material support around women in the industry. Mm-hmm. We're not even allowed to talk to each other about our work.
There's a theme that we're going to come back to time and time again, and it's a theme that has commonality, for example, with the war on drugs, where essentially prohibition, which sounds so noble from the powers that be, because somehow they're going to eradicate thousands of years of pattern human behavior overnight, just because it's part of their quote-unquote moral code that they would like to import upon everyone, that you're simply creating a more difficult, dangerous situation for literally everyone involved. In the case of, making marijuana illegal, okay, now you force people to the streets to buy product there, which is often doctored, all the things that we've talked about at length in the coalition over the past few years. In the case of sex work, what you've done is, and here in Rhode Island, where it's particularly challenging, where at one point or another there was sort of a backward legality to it, you haven't improved people's lives. People are still going to engage in consensual sexual behavior with money as a factor.
Right.
You're increasing a public health risk because everything is more difficult about attending to your health concerns. You're forced onto the street, if you will, and forced to engage under the table. Everything becomes more dangerous. Everything becomes more.
Exactly.
You're putting at the risk the people you're aiming to save.
Exactly, and that's the biggest irony of criminalization. The arguments for criminalization is that they claim they're trying to protect vulnerable women, and that for me gets very, very personal because I'm someone with a story that I think fits more of your stereotypical narrative of how people get into the industry. I was a teenage runaway, and I had to survive. And I wouldn't say it was a choice or something that, I was gunning to do. And I was young and vulnerable. I did need help. And criminalization made that help impossible to get. there was no hope of me being rescued because, interestingly enough, to be a trafficking victim, you have to fit a very, very, very narrow criteria, which most women, including most trafficking victims, just don't fit. And then, as I got older, like, my relationship with the industry changed. I'm now a consensual adult worker. I'm, 27 years old. And the industry, as much as it was something that was painful for me and a situation of coercion when I'm younger, it's now what saved my life. I'm in school studying for a STEM degree. I have a career outside of sex work, and that wouldn't have been possible without the sex industry. So for me to be able to have the economics, the money to build a life for myself, it just wasn't possible. There was no other way. Right. And so it just really gets me that the people who really are adamant that we want to save you, we want to protect you, are the same people who have made it impossible to get help. I mean, right now there's a bill in Congress that would make bad date lists illegal and listservs, which means that the Swap USA board could face up to 25 years in jail. And that's a list warning people about dangerous clients. Right. How is that a bad thing? Why is that a bad thing? How is that helping people to make it impossible for us to talk to each other? Well, I just don't understand it.
That jihad has been going on for a couple of years now. You've got the rent boy situation. You've got the type of economic pressure levied against Craigslist, now Backpage. You've got issues where, number one, you've got First Amendment rights at stake. But, again, speak to the role that technology takes in actually ensuring the safety of everyone involved, again, in a consensual relationship.
Right, and like with Backpage and Craigslist, if we want to talk about the women on the margin, survivor workers, I worked on the street. And the number one thing that brought us inside, and by bringing us inside, that gives us more control over our working environment, gives us more ability to screen, like that makes things 10 times safer. And they're taking away these platforms to actually greatly improve our working conditions.
Yeah, and putting people financially and criminally at risk for being part of this industry is ludicrous.
Right.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. And just for, if your concern is trafficking, the trafficking is a real issue, and it's a very serious issue. I know there are people close to me who have been trafficked. It's been, my experience. These platforms help. Having places where sex workers can talk to each other, where we can see each other working. That's how you're able to find the women who are being coerced.
Right.
And they're punishing people. They're punishing people for making these platforms. They're punishing people for using these platforms.
Based on your experience, having been out in the life and being, as you've described it, on the streets, if you can, describe your relationship with law enforcement while you're out effectively involved in the sex industry.
Law enforcement is probably the single most terrifying aspect of my job. From when I was on the street and up till now, where I'm a more established worker inside.
And why is that?
Just, okay, I'm going to be very blunt. A client can hurt you. They can rape you. They can murder you even. But police do that too. And they do that just as much as clients. And on top of that, they can humiliate you. They can out you. They can publish your mugshot in the paper. They can put your face on TV. Your name can be in the headlines. So not only can they violate your bodily autonomy, but they can also destroy your entire life.
Right.
I don't have a relationship with law enforcement. I don't want one. But there's nothing but antagonistic. I mean, unfortunately, there are a lot of officers who abuse their power when it comes to sex workers because we have no one to go to. And I mean, I think this is getting more attention now, but in about 22 states, it's legal for an officer to have sex with someone in custody. And I think across the country, it's completely illegal for an officer to have sex with a sex worker before arresting her. And they do. And it's not consensual, but there's nothing we can do about it.
Right.
And I just, even if, the officer is just doing his job and isn't, abusing power, it's still the idea that I'm going up, I'm going to work, I'm doing something that I think is good. I'm helping people. My work helps people.
Right.
And because of that, people with guns and handcuffs can rip me from my home and lock me in a cell just for going to work and trying to do something good.
And therein lies one of the central themes of this evening, the difference and the challenges surrounding decriminalization versus legalization.
Right.
You talk about, the threat of physical violence, but at the same time, it's clear from speaking to you now that the economic violence that can take place against a sex worker if they're outed is actually, in some ways, it's difficult to talk about this because certainly don't want to diminish one over the other, but the life-changing impact of being outed, of having a paper trail, of having society put you out in public on one of these hideous websites where, they're, in order to save the village, you're going to burn it. All right. Talk about some of the real-world implications of once you're outed as a sex worker. What can happen, particularly if you're a single mom with children?
You lose your kids. I mean, you lose everything. I mean, I know women have been outed and they had to start over elsewhere, do everything. They lost everything.
Right.
And now in the day of the internet, you can't recover from that. It's very, very hard. Once it's out there, it's out there.
Right. There's no magic erase button on the web, particularly if law enforcement is, in some cases, going out of their way to publicize your contact information, your social media information, and most damaging, your picture, which, of course, then can be appropriated for all sorts of purposes because, well, it's okay. Law enforcement has branded you as someone, quote unquote, undesirable, and it's okay then for society to discriminate against you in matters that, as you mentioned, are both horrific and life-changing. I want to...
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, I mean, after being outed, like trying to get a job in a different industry, can't. It's essentially like a hard stop, given the conditions right now.
Right.
And it shouldn't be.
Explain what you mean by survival sex.
Well, for those of us who work in decriminalization, we have this framework called the 3 C's. And it's how we kind of conceptualize how people enter and stay in the industry. And those C's are choice, coercion, circumstance. Everyone in the industry has different levels of that, of what's driving them in there. Survival sex work is really when your circumstances are your number one push into the industry. So for me, I was, on my own as a teenager. It was a way for me to get a place to stay inside. It was a way for me to get money for food or actually get food. For other people, it's the way they are able to house themselves. Survival sex is really very, very economically motivated, and people still find value in what they do even then. But for a lot survival sex is what we used to talk about, the kind of stereotypical view that people have of like the streetwalker or the one who uses drugs and uses to do sex work through the drug habit. And a lot of sex work advocacy tries to shy away from like those stories because they don't want to build a stereotype. But like homeless sex workers exist. I was one of them. And you can look at the big picture and say like, well, that's pretty like messed up that you have to choose between like trading sex for resources or like being outside. That's not really a choice. And like, okay, it's not. So within my constrained circumstances, I can make the best choice for myself. I can look at my circumstances and say, what makes the most sense? How am I going to survive? And a lot of us do that. Mm-hmm. And a lot of diversion programs from the sex industry just don't acknowledge that within our circumstances, we are able to look at our options and decide what is best for us. And instead treat us like mindless, I don't know, like just people who don't actually like, don't think or don't have like logic behind the decisions we do. For me, like doing survival sex work allowed me a lot more freedom and autonomy over myself than if I relied on social services. Mm-hmm. A lot of times my choice was to stay at a shelter which had, which really was like a prison with the way where, I would get searched, I'd have my bag searched, I'd get pat down, I'd be at risk of getting my stuff stolen, or I could trade sex to have a nice warm bed sleep for the night.
Right.
And that was the decision I made, and I would take the same one over again. And a lot of diversion programs who want to help survival sex workers don't seem to understand that, like, we're making a decision. There's a thought process behind this.
And I want you to hold that thought for a second because that's a critical element of the conversation. What this show attempts to do at all times is to destroy urban myths. And the urban myth that the far and away the dominant share, the lion's share of individuals involved in sex work are there without any consent, without any decision, we need to address that. I just want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors, of course. It takes a lot for an individual local business to sponsor an organization like the Coalition. We clearly handle issues, whether it regards to sex work, whether it regards to political issues that are sensitive, that require advocacy, whether it regards the war on drugs, human rights issues. We've covered all of those in the last few months, both from a national and a local perspective. So the courage of individual business to step up and support independent media is a critical part of the calculation. Without them, we simply wouldn't be here. I want to take a moment, of course, to thank Air Sciences, airsciences.net. They provide a range of services, including professional disinfectant, mold remediation. I've spoken with Daryl Gould this week. They're based in the East Bay, but cover all of Massachusetts. And what we look forward to doing is we're going to be offering a special later on this week that's going to address the biological hazards, and we're going to call it our spring cleanup special. Because between the norovirus, between the flu, and everything else that's come down the pike in the last few weeks, Daryl's got some excellent home-based solutions to provide a healthier home for you and your family, and a healthy office, whether you be involved in anything from just general business or the wide range of healthcare and child care facilities that Air Sciences supports. So again, sponsoring this now is airsciences.net. Daryl Gould and his crew are there for you, and clearly they're there for independent media, and we salute them for that. Joining me right now on the line for the very first time is Autumn. Autumn is joining us. She is one of the founding members of MASWAN, which is the Sex Workers Advocacy Network. She's based up in the Massachusetts area. She's been talking about her life and also the legal and the social and the society challenges that folks in the sex work face. I want to point out again that it is the attitude of this show that this is not a victimless crime, because in most cases there are no victims, and in all cases where there are no victims, there is certainly no crime. This is a consensual behavior by two adults or more who are entering into it. The difference between that and as society would define it, a conventional relationship, is that there's an economic element to it. That is it. So we're talking about all of those issues, talking a little bit about prohibition. We were just talking about survival sex, which leads up, and Autumn led into a great segue, because there is an entire industry out there that would genuinely support, or in some cases purport, to help folks involved in sex work. These have grown exponentially as trafficking has become a concern. And I want to say, first of all, Autumn, what services does SWAP and by extension SWAN offer in that respect? And then give me a little background on what you think the efficiency, the efficacy, of all these non-governmental organizations that seem to have popped up everywhere in the last few years to aid trafficking victims.
Sure, I can do that. So SWAP and SWAN provides a bunch of different services. SWAP is an international organization, so each chapter does things a little bit differently. Here in Boston, we do a lot of education. We focus a lot on working with existing nonprofits and educating them about the sex industry and the issues. Just because a lot of organizations, including anti-violence organizations, just don't know anything about it. And that is a public health concern for us in terms of sex workers. We also do legislative advocacy. We keep an eye on the State House, and when the bills come up that deal with sex industry, we make sure we're looking at them. We're speaking to legislators. There's currently a bill right now in the Massachusetts State Legislature that is looking at decriminalization, which is very exciting. It'll probably be a bit of time before it moves anywhere, but we're making sure we have boots on the ground. And talking to legislators about that. Mm-hmm. We also organize a lot of different support services. Unfortunately, due to the current legal climate, I can't really go into detail about what those are without putting people at risk.
Right.
I wish I could, because it's really just women helping women. So we do provide different types of support outlets for people who are currently in the industry.
Right, and that's part of what, and this is my words, not yours, that's part of what's so disgusting about today's legal environment, because you have folks who are without government involvement organizing, collectivizing to support folks in your industry, and because of these laws, you're actually prevented or challenged to provide services to yourself and to your community because of all of these different laws we discussed. At what point, I mean, do you see, as someone who's literally boots on the ground in Massachusetts, do you see attitudes changing at all? Are folks starting to understand that their attempts to quote unquote save people are putting them in harm's way?
I would say things are changing slowly. The feminist movement has been actually really adopting new views pretty quickly on the sex industry, which has been refreshing. I would say, as far as the majority of the mainstream legislators, no. The problem is that the anti-trafficking nonprofits, they control the narrative. They control almost all the dialogue on this issue. They are well-funded, mostly funded by the evangelical right, interestingly enough. And they can access platforms that we can't.
Right.
I mean, they can organize openly, and we can't. So unfortunately, while things are changing slowly in certain pockets of society, the mainstream still has this very inaccurate view of the sex industry where you have people who are being forced into this all the time, where the number one concern is trafficking, where sex industry is just generally bad for society. It's a pretty difficult situation. I would say, especially on the law enforcement side. The state police and Boston Police Department work very, very closely with this organization called Demand Abolition, which advocates for the criminalization of the industry and the eventual abolition of the industry. And And, I'm someone who really tries to find common ground with people. Like I said, I have my own experiences with violence in the industry. Many of us who are anti-crime, who are for crime, have been trafficked, know people have been trafficked. So we really do try to find common ground. But it becomes impossible when these organizations consistently, over and over again, advocate policies and practices that hurt us. And unfortunately, right now, law enforcement in Massachusetts is working arm in arm with those organizations. Despite almost globally the public health community advocating decriminalization, despite the decades academic research has shown decriminalization improves health outcomes, improves anti-violence outcomes, improves almost every aspect of a sex worker's life. Despite that, law enforcement is still pairing with these organizations, and I'm sure the funding they get through the anti-trafficking advocacy is a part of that.
Right, and that's some of the commonality that's shared, that law enforcement shares with the war on drugs. You've got this an eerily similar environment. You've got, on one hand, you've got law enforcement who receives all sorts of funding, and don't for a moment think that the politics of this are wrapped directly around the money. It's the age-old cliche, follow the money. So when you've got law enforcement receiving a lot of funding, on top of that, you've got these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who receive a tremendous amount of funding. And what's astonishing, based on my research, is that there's little or no accountability as to, and I'll use in the coalition air quotes, success, as if they actually even attempt to define what success is. There's an astonishing amount of money to be made running these non-governmental organizations here in Rhode Island, and we'll be publishing these figures later in the week. I didn't want that to cloud the conversation, but there's one where that's very prominent in the state, well-funded, where the executive director makes well into six figures.
Yes.
With, again, little or no accountability. We wouldn't even accept that from Rhode Island State or Massachusetts state government. But because they cloak themselves in this sort of respectability, and they are able to literally fan money around the states that they operate in, they're met with open arms. Very similar to a number of the anti-legalization organizations in marijuana, both in drugs in general. And at the same time, I mean, from your personal experience, we talk about services. Services being everything from health services, whether that regards birth control, personal health, STD, any one of these features, or for example, if in fact these organizations are obsessed with ending trafficking as we know it, a serious issue, I would imagine the services that you'd want them to offer would be, quite frankly, secure housing. In your experience,
Exactly.
is a lot of that available from these organizations?
No. There is a huge lack of material aid available to people who want to exit the industry. Mm-hmm. I actually had a friend who is disabled, in a wheelchair, survival sex worker working off the street, and I tried for months and months and months to get her help in Massachusetts, which is a fairly liberal state, which has a fairly decent social safety net, and there was nothing. We had to go out of the country to get her help. These organizations don't provide services, and services they do provide are inadequate.
So what do they do then? I mean, what?
And no.
I'm not trying to be flip here, but
That's a very good question. We wonder the same, because I'll tell you, we do street outreach. We're out on the streets, every week. We're there. They're not. We don't see them, when we're at community meetings about getting more affordable housing. We don't see them when we're fighting for less policing. They're not there. We don't. So the fact is, for trafficking survivors and for survival sex workers, the basic needs need to be met, right? For someone to exit trafficking, for someone to exit the industry, you need housing, you need food, you need health care. Right. And so any organization that wants to fight for sex workers or for trafficking victims needs to be fighting for housing and food and health care for these women. And they're not there. And we're not sure what they're doing, besides passing laws that hurt us.
Right. Because in any of these conversations, you talked about, you folks are the ultimate stakeholders, and stakeholder is kind of the buzzword of the year now, I guess, which we accord to people who are intimately involved in the, very often the unintended side effects of legislation. Is there any attempt at outreach from these large, well-funded organizations to actually engage in a dialogue?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. Is there any attempt by these large, well-funded organizations to engage in any sort of dialogue with folks who are the acknowledged leaders of the sex worker community? Are they reaching out, or are they just attempting?
No, these organizations won't even speak to us. A common refrain of these organizations about sex work-led, a common refrain from anti-trafficking organizations about sex worker-led advocacy groups is that we're far from pimps. And it doesn't matter how far from the truth that is, they won't speak to us. And they don't want us at the table. And you have to ask, why do organizations who claim to want to help us, help those in the industry,
Right.
won't talk to us, don't want to hear us?
There was I filed this under the category of articles I wish I clipped and kept long before the web. There was an article a number of years ago in the Boston Globe about an organization, and this is explanatory. An organization existed in Massachusetts to fight teenage pregnancy. They found themselves in a situation, perhaps in part due to their efforts, maybe not, where teenage pregnancies started to drop. They then found themselves in the unhappy position of having to justify their funding because people were employed, there was money to be made, and they were scrambling because, well, they hadn't figured out anything yet. You know, I'll throw this out, it's a rhetorical question, but I'm sure regular listeners will get my sarcasm. It's all about the money. You know, there's, whether it be fighting cigarettes, whether it be fighting sugar, whether it be fighting more serious issues like drugs and sex work, whether as if it needs to be fought, because again, it's consensual activity. There is a great deal of money. There are industries surrounding it now. You know, you can, you know,
Right.
if I know people who are freelance writers, and if they can gin up something good about sex trafficking, woohoo! You know, they're going to get published. If you hire a good grant writer, there's a pretty good chance that you can get some money to quote unquote study the situation. You know, it's sad. It's all about the money.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you have to follow where the money's going. The money gets donated or gets, you know, funded through grants to these organizations, and then where does it go? It goes to law enforcement. It goes to, it doesn't go to sex workers. Like, it's not going to building structure or support for sex workers.
Exactly. Well, Autumn, I first of all, if before we sign off here, because we're going to have Emma join us in just a couple minutes.
Oh, great.
Is there anything you'd like to add? If the Attorney General of the state of Massachusetts, Maura Healey, who we tagged, by the way, in our Twitter promotion of this show, if there was something you wanted to say to her in terms of the reality of law enforcement and the reality of sex workers' rights and the reality of, well, let's just say how the world really works, what would you say to someone like that in a position of government who could literally break glass, add water, and change things?
That's a really good question. I would say that if the people you're trying to help are afraid of you and afraid of what you represent, then you're doing it wrong. And it doesn't matter what your own beliefs are telling you. It doesn't matter what your own ideology is. If your goal is to help, then you actually have to help.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And you're not. So.
No, I very, very, very well said. Well, I hope this isn't the last time we speak. We're going to have a couple of folks, other folks from your organization on, but I admire your tenacity and your ability to organize, to coalesce, to bring people together for a common cause. Your points are convincing, and most importantly, they're heartfelt. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight and really kind of putting yourself out there as you've done throughout the entire history of this organization.
Thank you so much for giving us a platform. It's such a simple thing, but it's not something we often get.
Well, tonight's really just the beginning. I want to stress that. Just as the coalition has been involved in a number of causes, this is clearly an issue as time has come. And from our tiny little pulpit here on the web and in Rhode Island, we will seek to affect change for both the men and women who have decided to pursue sex work as a livelihood, and also for the people who have decided that perhaps they're looking to transition so that a sense of fairness, a sense of equity, and a sense of opportunity could be created for everyone in an environment that's perhaps reflective of perhaps just maybe a little bit of emotional maturity and a whole hell of a lot less judgment, and as a result, a lot of freedom and a better life for everyone. So again, thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you, and have a great rest of the evening.
Great. Folks, we're going to take a quick break right now. That was Autumn. She is one of the founders of MASWAN, an organization that works in conjunction with SWAP. We're going to take a very quick break. Joining us in just a minute or two, we're going to transition through the miracle of Skype phone. We're going to bring on Emma, Natalie, and then ultimately Sarah is going to be joining us from very much from an academic perspective. Folks, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. Yes, it's rainy. Yes, it's miserable out. But after listening to this show, take a moment, go out and sample some of Divine Providence's pleasures. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. Please follow us on the Mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. And if you have a moment and you listen to this show now or in the future, please like us on Facebook at Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. Folks, stay tuned. We'll be right back.
And we're back.
We are back. We are the coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street, in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. On the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. And of course, CoalitionRadio.us, where this and all other shows will live in perpetuity by simply clicking on our past show page for our Coalition 1.0 and our AM/FM radio days, or YouTube channel, where it takes me a little while, but our crack staff here gets things up onto YouTube so you can re-listen and reanalyze. Very special evening tonight. We're dedicating this evening to, I think, a frank conversation surrounding the issues of legalization/decriminalization of sex work. With that in mind, we've invited folks from MASWAN on. So essentially, which is an ally network that's got a relationship with an organization called SWAP, a group of affiliates from around the country, which is an outreach project for sex workers. My personal views are obviously pretty clear. I believe in the free exchange of ideas, people, and commerce. I believe that consensual activity, whether it be economically based or not, is entirely appropriate amongst adults. I see nothing good from government involvement in just about anything at this point in my life. And when I see attempts at prohibition, whether it be regarding sex work, whether it be regarding the war on drugs, or literally just about anything, we know it at this point, over a 100+ year history, to be an abject failure. We know, and conversations tonight are clearly proof of that attempts by government to prohibit consensual, normal activity amongst adults typically makes that activity less safe, creates a climate of economic violence, leads to the destruction of people's lives, and yet somehow, well, we still do it. Because this time it's gonna be different. Oh my. I listen to horror stories of single moms who have lost their children because they are being outed as sex workers, as if somehow engaging in normal, a function of our biology, is something that you need to be outed for. So there's some shame associated with that. I've seen law enforcement spend untold millions of dollars in a desperately challenging economic climate to enforce laws that really bear no relationship to any sort of economic reality whatsoever. And yet we still do it. So the purpose of tonight is to have folks on who are involved in advocacy at a number of different levels for sex workers' rights. There's a great hashtag out there, I hope I get it right, sex work is real work too. It is. The individuals, male or female, who are involved in this on a day-to-day basis perform a valuable function to society. If they didn't, there would be simply no work for them to do. It really is that simple. It's not up for the individual to decide what is a valuable component to society. The only 2 people or 3 people or more who need to decide that are the people actually involved in it. Yep, I said it. It's none of anyone's damn business what people do amongst adults. So, with that as a backdrop, we'll continue our conversation. Joining me in this segment is Emma. She also is involved with MASWAN. We'll give links out to their website again. If you looked at the pre-show promotion, you can find a link directly to their website where you can find more information. Should either tonight or in the future, folks in the Massachusetts or Providence area who are involved in sex work are looking for, I don't know, it's for folks who are involved in their community, who are looking for support services, who are looking for, I don't know, just someone else to talk to. We'll continue on the coalitionradio.us to promote sites and places where they can do so with a degree of safety, with a high degree of confidentiality, and do so with people who, quite frankly, again, give a damn and care about them. And that's probably, if there's anything that comes out of this show, that's probably the most important thing. So again, I'd like to welcome for the first time to our show, Emma. Emma, thank you so very much for joining us tonight.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So tell us about your involvement with MASWAN and what you'd like to add to the conversation from your own personal perspective, what you feel comfortable discussing from your own personal history.
Sure. First, I want to start by thanking for having us on. As Autumn said, we really don't have platforms to speak that often because in our culture, speech tends to require money. So we don't have the ability to fundraise like other activist groups because some of us are criminalized. And so we really appreciate these opportunities. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Of course.
So just to reiterate, MASWAN, the Massachusetts Sex Worker Ally Network, is the ally network associated with SWAP Boston, which is the Sex Workers Outreach Project, which is the national organization, and we're just the Boston chapter. So I'm a member of both organizations. I am what you would call an escort. And so I come at this work very much from the lens of having had an upper middle class upbringing and being an artist, and then deciding that couldn't make any money doing art, and reconnecting with a friend who was doing a sex work and really enjoyed it and recommended it, and taught me how to do it in a way that's safe, or as safe as it possibly can be under current conditions. So for me, it was absolutely a choice. I said to myself the first time I saw a client, if this doesn't work for me, if I feel violated or abused in any way, I will not pursue this line of work. But for me, it is my career, it is my job, it is my business. And I, for the most part, with very few exceptions, absolutely love my work. My clients are gentlemen. They bring me gifts. They're incredibly thoughtful. I've built some very long-lasting, meaningful relationships with a lot of people, and normally my work feels pretty much like therapy for these men, and I feel like they bring pieces of themselves to our sessions where things that can't be necessarily seen or understood or empathized with by their families, their wives, other people, their friends, other people in their lives. I create a safe space for men who are struggling and need someone to talk to. Often my sessions are just about talking a lot, and maybe, that human physical intimacy that is a biological necessity for all primates, including us. So that's my lens on this work, which is quite different from Autumn. But I'm also very engaged in the activist part of it, through the lobbying part of it, and just trying to get people out there to hear, to listen to us. And I'm so glad that you asked her if you could say one thing to Maura Healey, what would it be? May I answer that question as well?
Absolutely, no, please.
Great. So, so Maura Healey, I think she's just the darling of like the Boston Herald and the Globe. She gets all kinds of press, which is great, good for her. She's done some fabulous work with, the travel ban stuff in particular. But on this issue, we really don't see eye to eye. Because I don't think that women like Maura Healey or people who come from her generation and her point of view can understand and comprehend the idea that a woman could make a choice to be a sex worker.
Right.
I can understand how that would be hard for a lot of women to, and men too, to be like, how could you put yourself in such a dangerous position where you don't know who's walking in your door? I really believe in people's ability to broaden their minds. So I would like your listeners to understand that there are women who love doing sex work, and it's about sex, but it's also about human beings and how fascinating they are. And there's never a dull day at work. Sometimes it's a good day, sometimes it's a bad day, but there's never a boring day in sex work. For Maura Healey, I would just say, just let me do my fucking job. Excuse me. I know it's not supposed to swear. Just let me do my job. Just let me not be policed. Let me not have to be looking over my shoulder for cops all the time. And if you want to do work around this issue, you need to consult us. You need to speak to sex workers, because her perspectives and her speech is not reflecting my lived reality and the lived reality of most of my friends doing this work, which is, whether or not they enjoy it as much as I do, it is our best option, and we do not want it taken away from us.
Why do you think there's, I'll call it, for lack of a better term, an air condescension between someone like Maura Healey, and I'm going to project onto her. These are my words, as always, not yours. But it strikes me that there's a real conflict going on between, and it's across a number of areas, between a feminist from Maura Healey's generation, who is so condescending towards you making a choice, which, by the way, I'd always believed to be the point of the feminist movement, to allow women to make their own choices.
Yeah.
All right. Why do you
Right.
think that exists?
So, my belief as a 30-something-year-old woman is that feminism is the belief that the two genders, or the many genders, as we say now, are all equal, and they all should have equal rights under the law, equal pay under the law, and also the choice to do whatever they see fit with their own body, so long as it is not harming anyone else. I have a theory about this, actually, which comes from a client whose wife, who incidentally will no longer have sex with him, which is why he sees me, is from the second wave of feminism. And I think the second wave of feminism was very much, which is where women like Maura Healey and Swanee Hunter living in their minds, was very much, feminism is a woman's ability to say no to sex, whereas previously women didn't necessarily have the right to say no. Within their marriages. Marital rape was incredibly common within, just street corners or any situation. And second wave feminism was very much running as far away in the other direction as they possibly could. So also with the sort of free love movement, I think a lot of women didn't necessarily get treated particularly well in those individual encounters. And I think that left them with this perception that men will take anything they can get, and men are fundamentally, when sex is involved, bad. I think there's just this strong association with men and sex and negativity within this generation of women. And Gloria Steinem will reiterate this as well, in addition to many psychologists who, quote unquote, research sex workers. They really cherry pick the data to sort of reflect their own agenda. But I think the reason that it is hard for them to understand that a woman like me can possibly exist is that for them, it's all about the right to say no. And for me, it's all about the right to do whatever I want with my body. My body belongs to me. I have sovereignty over it. I think it's very libertarian, although I'm not a libertarian, libertarian to say that any individual should have sovereignty over their own body.
Right.
They should have the decision. It's not the state who should get to decide what I do with my body. It is me.
I'm not. I'm the chairman of the State Libertarian Party. I'm not going to fight that. You're absolutely right. Now juxtapose that, if you will, for a moment with the Me Too movement, because you've clearly got a variety of generational reactions to the Me Too movement, across the country. So, how does the Me Too movement, and it's still, I guess, largely in its infancy, one could say, but how does the Me Too movement react to consensual sex work? I mean, I always thought that the power, if you will, resided to a large degree, and this might be patriarchal, this might be old school, but I always found irony in that, and please feel free to jump all over me on this one, but on one hand, you've got a significant part of the feminist movement ascribing to you, not yourself, but ascribing to you victim status, when in fact it's clear
Yes.
that you, I'm saying you in the general, control
Yes.
the entire process.
In my case, I just want to make a distinction here because I do speak for SWAP as well as myself. In my work, I am in control of what happens. I can say no to a man at any point in any session, and that is a pre-understood thing in my echelon of the industry. There are a lot of women who are doing sex work who are not working in safe conditions, and that is a large part of that is just due to criminalization and being driven underground and not having recourse to legal protection if they do get assaulted or have a bad experience with a client. But to speak to your question about the Me Too movement and the interaction between that and the sex work rights movement and the movement for decriminalization, this is what a fascinating moment in history for women and for all of us. I think it's too early for the Me Too movement to have an official position on sex work. I don't think it's centralized enough. Nothing that I've heard. Although what I will say is that a few years back, Amnesty International changed their official position to be pro-decriminalization of sex work internationally. Mm-hmm. And a lot of actresses signed a letter opposing that. They disagreed with Amnesty International, and they saw that position as being extremely dangerous for women. So many very prominent Hollywood actresses and actresses from the UK and all over the world signed this letter saying, we disagree with the idea that decriminalization protects women. When the Harvey Weinstein accusation started coming out, I was fascinated to see some of those same women being the accusers of Harvey Weinstein and having been his victims. Mm. And for me, it was this aha moment where it was like, you have been in those non-consensual situations, and you can't see how other women can flip the table and be in the position of power as opposed to the man. But what I would say is that, and Sarah, who's going to speak later, can perhaps back up this with data, but in the countries where decriminalization or legalization of sex work has been implemented, incidences of rape and sexual assault actually go down. Mm-hmm. If men are allowed a legal, safe outlet for their very human, biological sexual needs, they don't need to assault their secretary. They don't need to assault migrant farm workers. They don't need to ask for sexual favors in return. And, I think a lot of people would say, like, with people like Harvey Weinstein, there's clearly some pathology involved. Like, this is not, it's probably Harvey Weinstein has seen sex workers, and that probably just didn't do it for him. It was more of a power thing. And I don't at all want to take away from the concept that rape and sexual assault is often about power, but it's also about, particularly in this area, there's this narrative of puritanical sex is evil. That need is evil. Bury that as deep in yourself as you possibly can. And I see men coming to me just hurting from having buried that narrative. And I think if we have a more healthy perception of sexuality within our country, and if men are able to acknowledge their sexuality and talk about it openly, and then get their sexual needs fulfilled in a way that doesn't harm anyone, that'll be a big old step to preventing this type of widespread sexual abuse in the future.
Yeah, and two, if you will, incidental reactions to the Me Too / Hollywood issue. Number one, I found it intriguing that Hollywood very quickly circled the wagons on the short-lived #SheKnew phenomenon, particularly as it affected, I believe, Meryl Streep. Because a number of I'll call them facilitators who, and my word's not yours, but clearly were sympathetic despite people acknowledging that, well, everybody knew. I also find the irony in the statement, and I was aware of the amnesty issue, because at the very same time, a number of the signers of that letter were involved in media that hypersexualized women. Again, that's their choice.
Precisely.
Right?
Well, they were doing sex scenes in movies, and yet they can't understand the perspective of a sex worker just because it's a simulated sex act as opposed to a real sex act. That to me seems a bit hypocritical, and I would love to drill down with one of those actresses about that, because it's bizarre to me. I don't get it.
No, and because it's got the imprimatur of Hollywood and they are placed on a pedestal, that somehow makes them different. Because
Right.
I think what's empowering about your organization, that's not a word I use very often, is twofold. Number one, it's reflective of the diversity of both male and female participants in sex work, both as client and as sex worker. But what your organization does very nicely is, and I believe has been a challenge, if I'm correct in my history of the sex worker movement, is that you've managed to bridge the gap between the different economic levels of sex work. And there doesn't seem to be, and this is strictly as an outsider, that perceived elitism that many would have used as politically to divide your movement. And that's critically important, because, like any consensual economic activity, sex work bridges every level of society and every socioeconomic group, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It's the oldest profession. It's everywhere. It is literally everywhere you look. Which is why, people like Maura Healey and these groups demand abolition have this narrative. Their line, their tagline is "End the demand," and to me, it's just the most absurd. I know this is slightly off topic, but to me, it's just the most absurd. Just think about that for a minute. End the demand for men having sex outside of society's. To me, it's laughable. I'm sorry, but I find it laughable, and I understand this problem with exploitation. But sex trafficking is a horrific reality, and I know people. I have dear friends who have been trafficked, and I've heard about their experiences, and it's horrifying. It's the opposite of what I do. They lose possession of their own physical bodies. But I've lost sight of your question. So identity politics are a big problem for any activist group in this country right now. I think it's just a really endemic problem to activism in general. But within SWAP, we've made a really conscientious decision to do the best we can at representing all of the different levels of sex work. And this isn't just talking about what the income is, for example, what the hourly rate is. Some of our members, when they work, they get paid in cans of soup. When I work, I get paid in cold hard cash, and lots of it. So those of us who have that privilege acknowledge it. I hope to a sufficient extent to our comrades, but we really do try to work together in a way that's productive. And the first time I ever went to a SWAP meeting, I can't even tell you how moved I was, because it didn't matter if this woman's a stripper, this woman is a dominatrix, this woman is a street level sex worker, this woman works primarily out of cars, or this woman is an escort like me. To be in a room full of people who understood my thing, this thing about me that I can't tell my family, I can't tell a lot of people. It's powerful. We need each other. So we honestly don't have any choice but to work across a class divide, because we just have this very profound thing in common, which to me just supersedes any other issue. We are hunted. You know, I know Quinn spoke to policing a bit. The police, Homeland Security, ICE, all of the FBI, all of these organizations, they are actively hunting us down.
Right.
People who are having consensual sex, you know, in a way that doesn't harm anyone. I think I do want to speak for 2 seconds to this idea of marital infidelity and what a problem it is. You know, I I had a client who actually I graduated him and he went back to his wife. He was adopted and he had some really intense emotional stuff around that he needed to work through, and it happened to be sex related. And he worked through it, and after about a year of seeing each other on a regular basis, he went back to his wife and he was able to ask for what he needed, and he was able to have a much better relationship with his wife. So I think also often, you know, guys leave my presence with a smile on their face. You know, they go back to their families and they're able to be better fathers and better partners to their wives, and you know, better with their colleagues and stuff, just because, you know, when I don't have sex for a while, I'm really grumpy. And I think that's true of a lot of people. I see men who haven't had sex in like 5 years. You know, I see men who are 30 and have never had sex with a woman and just want it to happen. And it's just this very healthy thing. So anyway, this type of work is idiosyncratic, and it is. But I think the through line with all of us is this vulnerability that we have, and this feeling that there is a cop behind every door, behind every window. It's terrifying, honestly. It's the worst part of doing this work. And when I started, and it continues to be, I think the only thing that would make me stop doing it is this terror of getting arrested, because we all know that when sex workers get arrested, we aren't accorded the same rights as you would be if you got arrested, you know?
Well, speak to that. Speak to that, please.
Yep. So this is where our movement overlaps quite a bit with the trans rights movement. So, you know, everyone's seen the movies where a cop pulls over to a street-based sex worker. You know, you can call them streetwalkers. I don't really like that term. I think it's and says, you know, I can arrest you, or you can give me a blowjob. But so those situations happen, and often they escalate, and often it becomes abuse. Particularly in the city of Boston, we have a huge problem with abuse of sex workers, and by anyone who shows sexual deviance of any sort. So, you know, there's this thing that's known among trans rights activists: walking while trans in Boston, you know, is basically a unwritten crime. You can be evicted for being trans. And likewise with sex workers, you know, you can be considered unfit to inhabit an apartment. You can be considered unfit to take care of your own child simply based on the fact that you're a sex worker. There's a perception of us that we are just intellectually inferior and incapable of making decisions about our lives, and not cognizant of the risks. And it is so frustrating. And
Right.
And being called a victim when you are doing something that makes you happy, golly, does that make me mad, you know? As you can, I think anyone can relate to that. Like, you're going about your life, you're doing things that feel right to you, you're doing things that feel safe, you're having really meaningful, deep interactions with people, and people are like, I picked up the Boston Herald, and there's Maura Healey saying, all these women are trafficked, they're all victims, I have never had a pimp, I've never worked for anyone but myself, I never could work, I'm too much of a, sort of narcissistic pain in the ass to work for anyone but me. And it's just, oh my God, it's so frustrating. And even the women who are not doing this as a career they feel empowered in. Sometimes a trans kid will get kicked out of their house and their parents don't understand them and they become homeless and they start walking the streets of Boston and winter hits and it gets really cold and they don't want to get hypothermia. So they see a guy in a car who's sort of soliciting and they'll say, I'm up for it. And it's a major driver of people doing sex work outdoors in the winter. It's one of the really brutal realities that we face because for those homeless youth and other homeless people, like sex work is become literally in those moments about survival. It's I get in this car and am warm for 30 minutes or I'm going to die. And Boston doesn't currently have facilities, particularly for homeless youth. We're not doing a good job of that. And so a lot of our activism centers around social services and, getting people out of these situations where they need to do sex work in order to survive. But would you rather have that person die of hypothermia, or would you rather have that man take them back to their house and have, maybe what is for the woman an unpleasant sexual encounter, but at least she gets a couple bucks out of it and maybe some food and the opportunity to be warm for a little while.
Right.
Would you rather, would these politicians rather these people be freezing because they're not providing the services to get them off the streets?
You raise an important point. The Attorney General's office in any state is the ultimate driver, if you will, of the standard of law enforcement that takes place. They've got a unique level of control in so many different ways, both literal and political. If a state's Attorney General decides that enforcement of this type is not a priority, it will ultimately be scaled back at some level. You've got this disconnect.
And that's all we're asking.
Right.
Honestly. That's decriminalization right there.
So you've got this disconnect because on one hand, I think we all understand what a serious crime and what a serious issue trafficking is. But
absolutely, yeah.
Right.
Obviously.
But
how could you not?
Consensual sexual activity that is monetarily driven is overwhelmingly described as trafficking when it's... I'm not going to describe trafficking as an outlier event. I'm not going to take that step. But at the same point in time, it seems like a significant amount of the activity, and here's part of the problem with it being a criminal activity, very little public attention is paid to really breaking down the facts between how much is really trafficking and how much is really consensual in nature. How much of it is pimped and forced, how much of it is two adults getting together and agreeing to terms. So in the same way that we really don't have a real clear understanding of the effects of drugs because of this politicization, this criminalization, the same thing is true, I believe, in the world of pay-for sex. Now, does that mean then, in your mind, do you believe that, and I'm not going to say Maura Healey in particular, but people in the state's Attorney General's office intentionally conflate trafficking with consensual activity, or is it a misunderstanding? Are they intentionally hyping the whole trafficking scare in order to generate funds for interdiction, or are they just confused? It's intentional or otherwise. What are your thoughts as someone who's an activist and involved in the community?
Oh boy, I hate that you asked me that question because, honestly, with my privileged upbringing, I love giving people the benefit of the doubt. I believe that human beings are fundamentally good people. Mm-hmm. But it is very hard to give these people who are driving the narrative that all sex work whatsoever is trafficking the benefit of the doubt when they're just so when I exist, I'm like, I just want to scream out like, I exist, I'm possible. And there are examples of me throughout history, in our country's history, in the immediate present, in literature, in we're all over the place. We're on Twitter, we're on websites, we write books, we exist. And so I hate it when I get backed into a corner and have to say this, but I think anti-trafficking rhetoric is extremely sexy politically right now. For whatever reason, in our dear old city, Boston in particular, and in the country at large in general, it is very hard to find voters who will see someone doing work that is anti-trafficking driven and have that voter say, oh, I'm not going to vote for her because she's not doing anti-trafficking in the right way, or him or whoever, right? It's kind of a non, and I hope this is changing, but it's a non-argumentative, it's a completely neutral, like universally acceptable standpoint to be anti-trafficking, right? But this narrative of all sex work is trafficking is just so ridiculous. Like, under current law, I like to say, I have 2 cats, right? They wear bling. They have really fancy collars. They have rhinestones on their collars, whatever. I just adore my cats. According to current federal law that was passed in, I think, 2015, my cat could be considered to be trafficking me. Like, I am trafficked by someone. I live with my partner. We keep our finances separate. Under the law, he could be considered to be trafficking me. He could be arrested for trafficking me. You can't arrest a cat, but this is the level of the absurdity that we're dealing with here in this rhetoric. And what we're trying to do with MASWAN is with our allies, giving sex workers a public face that often we ourselves can't be, in order to put our narratives in front of these politicians in a way that's undeniable. It's slow going. It's slow work. We had Bobby Taylor, one of our members, speaking at the Boston University Symposium recently on understanding commercial sex policy, which was a great event, and it was really wonderful because there were no other organizations invited to that event who represented sex workers specifically. Like, people were all talking about us, but they were not speaking our voices. So,
and that brings up an interesting point. Do you find that type of appropriation is taking place routinely, where political groups without any real relationship with, or simply just calling and saying, hey, let's talk, are purporting to represent you?
Appropriation is the word to use about this. I mean, so I just look at these people who are so well funded. Back when I was super naive, I saw a poster for On Demand that said 80% of sex workers are trafficked and something or other, and it was just an awful poster. And I tore it down and ended up getting in a really interesting conversation with the owner of the cafe where the poster was. But so I went home and I did some research on the demand, and expected to find all these evangelical right-wing people involved. But the board of directors of these organizations, they're chock full of like people who worked on the Obama campaign or for the Obama administration or Clinton campaign. They're liberal, they're Democrats, right? They're and so these are people that I'm voting for. And I had this moment where I just lost it. I just started crying because I was like, these people I've been voting for and trust to speak for me in politics are appropriating my narrative, turning it into a negative thing, and then turning it into a thing that makes my life less safe, that it literally endangers my life. Because if I get in an encounter with the police, that's dangerous. If I get in a bad encounter with a client and want to report a client for rape, or want to call the police because, for example, one of our members once came to a support group and said, I was just raped at gunpoint. And she reported it, and good for her. That I was blown away by how brave she was. But if God forbid, but if I ever do get raped by a client, I honestly don't know if I could go to the police. And so for these people to be making these laws and continuously working on this very, again, sexy topic of anti-trafficking, it's just like, please listen, please listen to us. Please speak to a sex worker. Please speak to a currently working sex worker, because there are women out there who have been trafficked, who have organizations such as My Life, My Choice in Boston, who are fully on that boat with Maura Healey and Swanee Hunt and conflate all sex work with trafficking. And they're former sex workers, so their word is taken for, is given a great deal of stock. But currently working sex workers need a place at the table, because these politicians, as you say, they're appropriating our lives, and they're victimizing me and then using that to get legislation through, which is infuriating.
It's interesting, and finally, as a society, we've evolved at least somewhat with regard to drugs, particularly in the wake of the opioid crisis, where Good Samaritan laws have been passed, where folks who are at a crime scene, and this is particularly important for folks who are may have been incarcerated before and are on some level of probation, who could report a health incident without fear of being criminalized themselves by simply being at the scene. Is it?
Yeah, that doesn't exist for us.
Right. I was gonna say, is it time for, folks to be able to simply report a fundamental violation of their human rights without fear of incarceration themselves? Given the element that we operate in the city on the hill, Boston, which perceives itself to be so very, very, very liberal, and so incredibly condescending. Again, I'm full disclosure, folks, I'm a libertarian. As Huck Finn would say, I got no truck with liberals, because just because of I'm going to vent for a second. I hope you don't mind. Just because of this kind of crap. All right. I just want to point out that here's trivia for you, and this is really from the marriage equality movement, is that the only openly gay individual who has ever run for the president of the United States and gotten an electoral vote was actually a libertarian. Just had to say that, and it's true. All right.
Yeah.
It's infuriating that people would come up with this unholy brew, this cocktail, if you will, of cultural appropriation mixed in with a healthy dose of condescension, a little bit of ignorance, and a whole lot of stupidity, and make a lot of money off of it. Forgive me for having somewhat feigned indignation over that. But what it ultimately comes down to is that people's lives are at risk. Literally.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I just, calling me a victim, that's not appropriation. It's not, it's literally verbal violence. Mm-hmm. Calling me a victim when I love my life and I just want to be left alone to do my work and make my money and pay my taxes, honestly. Hey, listen to this. I report my entire income and I pay taxes on all of it. I don't know how you personally feel about that, but as a citizen, I report it as ill-gotten gains. Obviously, I report it in a different way, but
consulting income.
Yeah.
Yes. By all accounts, if you take and it brings up a point that I've been waiting to make. If you take the word sex out and put engineering in, you're a superstar. And yet, and yet sexuality is so fundamental to the human condition, as you pointed out earlier in the conversation, that
absolutely,
that quite frankly, it's idiotic, for lack of a better term, to assume that somehow individuals could subsume that when it's a biological driven need. And as you point out so aptly, so much socially comes from it as well. And yet we criminalize that because overtly there's funds exchanged. I look at this alleged progressive administration we have, whether it's Republican or Democrat, it's irrelevant. They're all the same party. And I just wonder at a certain point when someone's going to wake the hell up. Normally you would say at this point in the conversation, if we were following the Hollywood script, how many people have to die before something is done? Well, people are dying. They're dying because of violence. They're dying because they're put in physiologically unhealthy situations. They are unable to get the type of health care and essentially be part of. They're marginalized completely from society, and then we wonder why society essentially is crumbling and why we've lost so many of these folks. Wow, yikes. Well,
No, you're right. People are dying. And if you're a person of color, or if you're trans, or if you're a gay sex worker, you are, I forget the statistic, but I think it's at least 5 times more likely to be killed by a police officer than me, or killed by a client. It's, and then when you talk about, STIs, there is a consensus in the global health community, but in the WHO, the World Health Organization, their policy is that decriminalization of sex work is the single most effective thing, if it were implemented internationally, that would prevent the spread of HIV. This is based on a study published in The Lancet, and it's really international consensus at this point. So there would be so many fewer transmissions. When this is just the basic idea. So walking wall, having condoms in your bag. If a police officer just suspects that you're a sex worker, searches your bag, and sees that you have a lot of condoms, that can be incriminating in and of itself. So you think about a woman going out on the street to make her money for the evening and trying to practice safe sex, but she can't carry condoms because that's incriminating evidence against her. This is why the global health community thinks that, it would be so incredibly beneficial to decriminalize and to stop punishing people for carrying safer sex supplies. And, it's just absurd to me. And I do want to wrap up because I know that my next colleague is ready to chat with you. She's raring to go. Is there anything else?
No. Again, I really appreciate the insight, the real view that all of you are affording us tonight. And again, I continue to be impressed by the level of inclusion, the thoughtfulness, how well your organization articulates what can be either an emotionally driven, prurient conversation, yet you've managed to encapsulate it very nicely, which is why it's an absolute pleasure to begin to work with your organization. I can't thank you enough for coming on and being so refreshingly honest. And I know that that's an extension of yourself, and I appreciate the time, the forthrightness, and quite frankly, the courage of all of you to come on and have this conversation. So,
thank you.
Let's keep the dialogue moving forward. And again, I want to thank you for coming on.
Absolutely. I look forward to talking to you more in the future.
Great. Well, again, folks, it's compelling stuff. And what's remarkable about tonight is we haven't really talked about sex, have we? It's all been about humanity, behavior, policing, law enforcement, the laws, our country's... Joe, we come in and take the next call. We literally have yet to have a single element of this conversation engage a sexual act. And we've been talking for, going on 2 hours now. This is the joys, by the way, of independent media. Yep. Okay.
Okay. Hello?
Hi, how are you? We're on to the next segment here.
Okay, awesome. This is Natalie.
Excellent. I want to just take a moment, folks. We're not going to take a break because I have a feeling we're actually going to run out of time tonight. Yeah, no, I'm here. Folks, you are listening to The Coalition tonight. It's a special 3-hour show that's dedicated entirely to a conversation surrounding the decriminalization of sex work. And everything in that universe, economics, our legal system, the politics, the sexual politics of all of it. In the past hour and a half or so, we've had Autumn join us, we've had Emma join us. Joining us now is Natalie. And we're just going to keep it rolling forward. Just as an aside, and we'll bring it up shortly, but this segment, I want to put a special thanks out to yet another one of our sponsors, is sponsored by Beacon Shipping and Logistics. BeaconShippingAndLogistics.com. They are an international auto transport firm based here in Work, Rhode Island. Again, proud sponsors of the coalition. Folks, if you could find an automobile shipper with international reach that was locally based, could affordably and safely transport your automobiles literally worldwide, whether it be that vehicle you buy off of eBay, whether that car that you found at a Ford dealer somewhere in California you want to get to you, maybe it's Aunt Sally's car that's going to be given to your kiddo to take out to college. You'd want to do that. 1-855-3-SHIP-IT or 1-855-3-SHIP-IT. Beacon Shipping and Logistics. They support the automobile dealer industry. They work with manufacturers, and they can work with you. Don't go out to one of those crazy websites and go on the bid and save $50, or maybe even overpay, God forbid. You know, use Beacon Shipping and Logistics. Again, they sponsor independent media. Independent media covers challenging, emotional, highly politicized, difficult issues like this. We need to support them as well. So Beacon Shipping and Logistics, 1-855-3-SHIP-IT. So let's keep the conversation moving. Joining us on the line is Natalie. She is with MASWAN, a group. It's an ally network that's affiliated with SWAP, which is the Sex Workers Outreach Project, with the Boston chapter. So the folks we're talking to are from Boston. We have, because of the sensitivity of the subject, we have granted them, as we should, as they are entitled to, a degree of anonymity. We're not asking folks to move beyond their comfort level. We want folks to describe their personal experiences, the industry as a whole, and the challenges they face in a manner that they feel is appropriate. Natalie, give us your background, if you will, in regard to MASWAN, how you got involved, and just talk about your perspective on the issues tonight.
Hi, Pat. Thanks so much for having me. I just wanted to take some time out first to thank you for having us on this platform. I can't say enough. This is an issue that is disregarded and has been thrown away by the mainstream left, is ignored by mainstream feminists, and I think it really speaks to both you, your ideology, and the people who listen to you that you're willing to give us a chance. That you're willing to think a little differently about an issue that most people already have their spoon-fed position on.
No, I appreciate that, but I want to say you make this show better by being here. If folks aren't willing to testify, whether it be in front of a courthouse, whether it be in front of a police station, whether it be in front of a legislature, or just in front of people who want to gain understandings and not be willing to accept what we're spoon-fed by so many organizations with their own vested interests. As far as I'm concerned, you guys are heroes. Welcome to the coalition. And again, I want to stress, this is the beginning of a conversation that will hopefully culminate in some level of justice, if you will, both at a societal level, on a legal level, and on a political level for the people who are involved in your community, because ultimately your concerns, your needs, your desires are no different than anyone else's. It's just time that we grew the hell up and accepted it and moved on, isn't it?
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. So I'll talk a little bit about my experiences. I got involved in the sex workers' rights movement when I was 16. It's been my dream to decriminalize sex work since then, and it will always be my dream until it happens. I've organized through MASWAN, through SWAP, and then also through a number of other organizations, local and national, and seen the issue from both, kind of the sex workers' rights side, the anti-trafficking side, and then all these sort of intersectional issues around it, like HIV/AIDS, LGBTQ issues, housing, immigration, etc. So that's kind of my background. But I just wanted to start off by saying, we've heard from Autumn tonight, we've heard from Emma, they have kind of a diversity of experience around sex work, even just between the two of them. And at the end of the day, sex workers are in the sex trade for a variety of reasons along the spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion. No matter what the original reason for entering the trade was, none of us should be in jail for it. None of us should be in a cage because we sell sex. And this issue matters not only because there are a lot of sex workers, which might surprise you, there are probably more sex workers than most people think. This issue matters because it affects all of us. Sex workers are the canaries in the coal mine of civil rights and liberties. So if you value any concept of sexual agency or privacy, you should be standing in front of sex workers, because when sex workers fall, women fall, and anyone who is labeled as the other also falls. There are so many examples throughout history of prostitution being used to target all women, regardless of whether they actually sold sex, because as it turns out, it's actually kind of hard to tell who is quote-unquote a sex worker and who is a regular woman. For example, laws like the Contagious Diseases Act in England in the 1860s, which allowed women to be randomly searched by police if they were suspected of being prostitutes. And so what does that mean in the 1860s? It's just whatever the police officer thinks looks suspicious. Mm-hmm. And if she was visually declared to be diseased, right, like there's no actual medical examination, you just look, then she would be locked up. And that's an extreme example, but it's still very much relevant today.
Oh no,
so
I agree with you 100%. I mean, if you look at anything from trafficking laws to the Patriot Act, they all pick and choose what issue they're going to use to essentially attack our civil rights and our civil liberties, and use that as a drop-off point to further erode those rights. Essentially, there's always got to be a demon created by government, created by a certain element of society, from which to essentially kick off their own attempt at gaining power. And right now, the two groups that are quite frankly the target of that are sex workers, folks involved in the use of drugs, and folks whose religion may not be a conventional Western religion. And the gross abuse of civil liberties and civil rights that's taken place by demonizing those folks and using that as an excuse is you're absolutely right, is horrifying. And so you are the canaries in the coal mine. I agree. It's a great way of putting it, and I hadn't really thought of it in that perspective before, so thank you.
Yeah, of course. I have to give credit to a comedian friend there for throwing me that line. So I just want to put that into the context of today. So Emma spoke a little bit about, sex workers and consent in the context of Me Too, and I want to extend that a little bit farther. Mm-hmm. In the same way that if women don't have the freedom to decide when or not they become mothers, they don't have freedom at all. Mm-hmm. If women don't have the freedom to decide the circumstances under which they have sex, they don't have freedom at all. Right? So if you get to say no, that also means you get to say yes under the circumstances that you want to, because consent extends in all directions, not just in the negative. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing, like, with the criminalization of sex work, the state seeking control over women's bodies, not just sex workers, but implicitly all women as well. Mm-hmm. And supporting sex workers' rights requires, a more complex understanding of consent that I'm not sure societally we're quite at, right, or even in the discussion of Me Too, because consent is not as simple as a vocal yes or no that fails to acknowledge the variety of coercive factors playing out in our lives at all times, including economic need. Mm-hmm. And looking at the issue of sex work is a really interesting way to think about consent and what it means to truly give an affirmation to something.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. In talking about Me Too, I'd love your, from your personal experience in your life, is Me Too, from your perspective, going to, at some point in time, at least attempt to communicate with the sex workers community? Is that happening in your opinion? And is it happening at the speed it should?
More or less in the last week or two, we've seen a couple of different pushes. There's an article by Melissa Bruto on BuzzFeed around what we can learn from sex workers on consent. There is an article in Time magazine that just came out that looks at what consent issues sex workers face. So there is some push, but the majority of the movement is dominated by like white feminists who are largely interested in like, you know, a narrative of perfect victimhood and like who is considered to be like the one that's hurt in a situation, and they're unwilling to engage with people who have sort of more complex understandings of consent. So I don't see it happening that much, but it is starting to happen. You know, it's there are like feminists in the movement who have some voice and access, and Me Too as well. So there's a little bit of talk.
Interesting. Now, I know one of the areas you wanted to focus on was incarceration. With respect to the level of incarceration that can be accorded to someone who's engaged in consensual sex work, and this a constant, you know, this blurring of the line between trafficking and incarceration, how much of that is a challenge to your community?
It is an incredible challenge. I want to roadmap this discussion a little bit. At some point, I want to talk about FOSTA as a very concrete example of how criminalization affects our community, but I'll talk generally about criminalization first. So I think, you know, Emma is one of my friends, and I care a lot about her, but she's not my priority in this movement. My priority is the most vulnerable populations. Criminalization is bad because it actively targets the most vulnerable people. And there are a couple of reasons why. Firstly, you know, as Emma mentioned, criminalization profiles and targets trans and POC people. If people engage in sex work because they have economic needs, and you know, there are a variety of reasons that people have economic needs. Sometimes your identity makes it more difficult for you to find economic opportunities.
Right.
Or maybe you were born into a situation in which you didn't have the educational opportunities to pursue what society considers like legitimate work, quote unquote. And so sex work is often like one of the only viable economic opportunities for people to engage in, and to criminalize them further for surviving is like at the root of why we want decriminalization.
Well, and if you could focus for a second, if you would, if you don't mind, on the trans community, because you've got, you know, the economic challenges of being in transition. You've got society's complete failure to accept at this point, at any high level, folks in transition. So very often sex work is almost exclusively at some level. It doesn't have to be, you know, it can incorporate in a variety of formats, but for a lot of folks who are in transition and for the trans community, that may be their only option, isn't it?
Yeah, it often is. It just is. And so when you criminalize what might be the only work or only way for people to feed themselves or to pay rent, then you're just targeting that identity. So that's all that's happening.
Right.
And that's on the consensual side, right? Like, I can't stress enough, no one is more against trafficking than people in the sex workers' rights movement. And that is because that is us. We are the trafficking survivors. They are our friends. They are our community. We know how criminalization affects trafficking. And like, that's another reason that we are vehemently opposed to criminalization. I can give you a couple of, you know, concrete reasons. You know, firstly, trafficking makes it really, really difficult. So criminalization makes it really, really difficult for people who are currently in a trafficking situation to report, because their traffickers can say, I'm just going to tell them that you're doing sex work, and guess whose word is probably going to be held in the court of law? It's usually the trafficker, because of discrimination against sex workers, and then discrimination against the various identities that tend to participate in sex work. And there's the argument that, like, oh, we should use laws and raids to find these people who are being trafficked and then save them. But if you truly believe someone who's in a trafficking situation is a victim, then there's no reason that they should ever have to interact with the state at all. Interactions with the police can be incredibly traumatizing for people who are currently in a trafficking situation, partially because they have those identities that tend to elicit a lot of discrimination, and partially because institutional interaction is just traumatizing in and of itself. I have so many friends, both trafficking survivors and consensual sex workers, who have been misgendered, who have been brutalized, and who have been raped by the police. And to introduce that element of state and then additionally potential incarceration and to trafficking victims' lives doesn't make any sense. Like, the community needs to deal with trafficking. There's no reason to arrest there's no reason to arrest trafficking victims in the first place. And that's how the law is set up right now. We arrest and then we vacate. But if they're truly victims, then why should they be arrested at all?
Well, and let's even take it a step back further. If you decriminalize the activity, to a large degree, the economic incentive to engage in trafficking in the first place is diminished because there's more of a free market aspect to it. People are able to then, engage in it, advertise it, and work with it as essentially as any other consumer product. We found through alcohol, we've found through marijuana, and we've found through sex work that if it's illegal, it becomes the purview and almost in some cases the exclusive domain of criminals who are looking to profit off of other people's sex work or other people's use of drugs or other people's use of alcohol back in the 1920s. I mean, what's insane to me is that their solution is actually fundamentally responsible for creating the illegal market that leads to trafficking. Again, feel free to jump in and tell me I'm full of it, but and maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but eliminate the economic incentive to operate underground in an illicit environment, and you eliminate, to a large degree, the pimp slash trafficker slash whatever we're calling it in this generation. Make it legal, make it open to the public.
Yeah, we're on the same page. We're on the same page. And,
wow.
and more importantly, numerous academic studies support that.
Mm-hmm.
The best way to target and to prevent trafficking is to decriminalize sex work so that anyone, regardless of why they're in the industry, whether it's because, they just love it, or because they were trafficked across national boundaries and they literally do not know how to get out of the situation, make it so that those people can report when people are exploiting them instead of being afraid to talk to the police because all their interactions with the police have been bad because they're criminalized. And then on top of that, have really rigorous anti-trafficking programs that include like health and social support services and legal services. Mm-hmm. That is the best way to prevent and reduce trafficking. It is not to, across the board, make sex work a crime.
Right. It's I guess I know we're the converted, but it seems remarkably straightforward enough to me. And one wonders, you've dealt with this as an activist. So in those times when you've been able to engage with folks who are in opposition to you, when you lay out the rather straightforward logic involved here, as all of you done an incredible job tonight, what is the reaction of whether it be law enforcement, whether it be the Maura Healey's of the world, whether it be the people funding these anti-trafficking, whether it be the religious zealots, what is the reaction when you lay out this rather simple, elegant logic?
Okay, so I think it's three things. First, there's just fundamentally some degree of ignorance because there's not a ton of conversation between sex workers and trafficking survivors and the people who claim to support them. There's a lot of cases throughout history where, like, famously, advocates will say, "I refuse to talk to prostitute women," or whatever. So there's just some baseline level of ignorance that's like contributing to this problem. Second, I think there's something around wanting like anti-trafficking work to be easy. People think that like, oh, if we can just people act as if like all trafficking is a situation where it's like some really brutal man who like steals away a young girl in the middle of the night and then forces her to sell sex for 10 years and then kills her. Like that's like how people think, like that's what people think trafficking is. Mm-hmm. And sure, that is the case sometimes, but mostly it's not. mostly it's a combination of like people that you might know already, who are like in the same social network as you. There's a variety of reasons that people get trafficked, and like a variety of reasons that make people more vulnerable to trafficking. And so like addressing those root causes of trafficking is really, really difficult, and people want to pretend that just passing a law criminalizing sex work more is going to make it go away. So I think that's the second reason. And I think the third reason is that there is, in the same way that like people conflate consensual sex work with trafficking, there's some mix-up in the anti-trafficking movement of motives. So there are anti-trafficking folks who will like work with sex workers' rights groups because they hear from their clients, the trafficking survivors, about their experiences, and they realize that they don't have it right. But then there are also groups who are based in Christian faith, who are fundamentally abolitionist groups. That is, they seek to end sex work at all costs. I know, I've spoken to leaders at a couple of these organizations. I know the chair of the board of one of the largest Christian-based anti-trafficking organizations in the nation, and I laid it out for him, this exact logic, which is that, criminalization hurts women who sell sex consensually, hurts women who sell sex out of economic need, and hurts trafficked women. Why are you still supporting criminalization? And this is what he said to me. He said, I acknowledge that, but for me, as a Christian man, sex work is so inherently evil that I will do anything at this moment to reduce the possibility of sex work existing in the future, even if it's just by a marginal reduction in probability. So that's the trade-off that a lot of anti-trafficking people, people who claim to be anti-trafficking but are actually just abolitionists, are making. Wow. Their point is that all sex work is bad, and so let's use this cover of anti-trafficking to actually just do whatever we can to make the lives of all sex workers and trafficking survivors and trafficking victims hell.
Mm-hmm. Wow. What the hell can you say to someone like that?
There's nothing to say, because he's staring at women right now that he knows he's hurting, and he doesn't care.
Right.
It makes him feel better that he might possibly, even though evidence doesn't support it, mm-hmm. Be reducing the likelihood of literally the oldest profession ever existing in the future.
Right.
That's what's in their minds.
One that is mentioned prominently in the Bible, I might add, by a significant protagonist in the Bible. Holy cow. It takes a lot to shut me up. You just did it. So you've got this sort of axis of evil, if I can appropriate that term, fighting you, all for their own, literally their own selfish self-interest, for lack of a better term. Law enforcement sees a tremendous amount of money from it. The prison community, prison industry in this nation, anything that you can make illegal is pretty good as far as they're concerned, because there's money to be made off of that. You've got an entire industry, the ad counts on all that, whether it be cigarettes, demon alcohol, or something more complex like sex work and trafficking, profiting from it. You've got this incredible complex array of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who are receiving incredible levels of funding to accomplish nothing. Yet largely your community is left to its own devices to fight for its own civil rights, to afford to folks looking to transition out of the sex worker community, to provide for them the legitimate services that they need in order to do so. You're largely self-supporting. And I know this is going to be my question for our next guest as well, but how do you fight all this? You guys are doing a hell of a job, but at any one time, is it overwhelming?
Yeah, we often say in the movement, this is the hardest movement to be in because people are coming in and out of it at any time. There's always a personal crisis happening. Someone's going to jail. Someone got beat up by the police. Someone had a violent client. Like, there's so much stuff happening, and yet people stay in it because we truly believe that fighting for sex workers' rights is the best way to not only protect ourselves, but to protect everyone. And Pat, as the last thing I want to highlight before I go off and let Sarah speak, because she has some really awesome points that she's going to bring up. There's something coming down the congressional pipeline right now that I think a lot of your listeners will find to be absurd. It's a bill we are really scared of, and I'm asking anyone listening to the show right now to call your rep and tell them that you don't support this bill. It's FOSTA, F-O-S-T-A, and there are a couple of different components, but one of the provisions of the law turns any promoting or facilitating of prostitution into a federal crime, punishable of up to 10 years.
Is
So
this,
that
is
means
this, is this the
any
Grassley
time-
bill? Is this the Grassley bill sponsored by Chuck Grassley in Iowa, I believe?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, Senator Chuck Grassley, I believe is his name, has been sponsoring legislation similar to this. I was just, off the top of my head, I was wondering if this was the Grassley bill. Offline, I'd love to have you guys send me documentation on this. Don't continue your train of thought there. Sorry I interrupted, but I want to have documentation on this so that folks can that we can actually publicize it and use our pulpit to advocate against it. But go right ahead. I'm sorry. So it's FOSTA.
No worries, Bill. It's FOSTA. So this bill has mutated a couple times. So the sponsors and the co-sponsors have changed. So in its form right now, and it's going to be voted on Tuesday, which is why it's a really urgent issue. It turns any promoting or facilitating prostitution into a federal crime punishable of up to 10 years. And that means anytime anyone uses the internet to talk about prostitution, if you post an ad for someone else, if you teach someone how to screen for safe clients, if you give a reference for someone else, if you host a bad date list, and a bad date list, just for context, is a list of clients that have been known to be violent or abusive. Right. So these are very basic harm reduction, anti-violence things that the community does for each other. That is going to become promoting prostitution, punishable of up to 10 years.
Wow.
And that means that everyone, because our organization does so much harm reduction, anti-violence, personal safety work, literally all of us who are calling in today, and then everyone else in our organizations, we would be subject to that same law, just for trying to keep each other safe.
So much for free speech, the free exchange of ideas, so much for consensual behavior, so much for, that pretty much nails just about every major constitutional protection folks have, in order to be free beings. That's astonishing. Yeah, I please send me after the show, if you have a few moments, a link to that, and we'll certainly do whatever we can within the libertarian movement, because that's just simply inhumane. And folks wonder how police states begin, how gross abrogations of personal liberties and civil rights begin. They begin with a simple stop and frisk, and then they evolve into hysterical reactions like the Patriot Act, and then they evolve into laws like that. And effectively, one person at a time, one group is marginalized, and they typically go after the folks who are perceived to be the politically weakest first, not perhaps the spiritually weakest, but the politically weakest. And in doing so, create an environment. What's the famous words of unholy words? If you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about. It's laws like that give you that should give you pause. Well, again, Natalie, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I don't think we're going to go to a break. I'm going to give my little promotion for Yacht Club Soda, which I've been drinking all night to keep the voice going. But again, I continue to be impressed by your organization, your message, the spirituality of it, and the inclusiveness of it, how accessible you make it, and just the individual courage it takes for folks to put yourself out, not to simply hide in the shadows, but to take a movement like this, politicize it, movement forward, and argue on behalf not just of your own situation, but for folks who may not have that strength, the ability, or the opportunity that you have. So my hat's off to you. Thank you so very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having us, Pat. I really appreciate this platform. I can't explain how much it means to even be invited to the table. You know, we want and can help ourselves. All we're asking is decriminalization so that we can do that. Just enable us to be able to fight for our rights. That's all we're asking for.
Excellent. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Folks, we're going to just, we're not even going to go after the air. I think we're going to ask Sarah to call in. I'm going to take this moment while we're doing our little AV thing. She'll call in. You'll hear the phone go off. But I always have to give a hats off to one of my sponsors. You've seen me drinking it all night. Of course, this is the seltzer, so this is the one that blows up all over my suit jacket and the AV equipment. Of course, I'm talking about Yacht Club soda. We'll bring them up in a second, but oh, there we go. The joys of new media. But anyway, I just want to take a moment. Hey, how are you? I'm doing the sponsorship things right now. Hey, I'm paying the bills. Sarah, we're blessed to have a number of wonderful local businesses who sponsor a show like this. As you can imagine, it takes a little bit of courage to sponsor shows that cover everything from sex work
I
to
can't look at its face
legalization.
because I think it's like off.
Oh, okay. You're coming in via cam then?
Oh, hey, sorry. No, I think the video. No, I'm on, right? Hi.
Hey, we can hear you talk. You want to try and bring her in on video?
Okay, good. I was watching the video and I'm like, I think he's talking differently than I can see. This is really confusing for my brain. But
Well, you're live on the air, so give us a second.
great.
We'll get this going somehow. So we're gonna try and bring you up on video. Is that it?
I have turned you off. Thank
Oh,
you.
All right. So let's just do the audio. That'll be fine. But I'll have you join us in a second. I have to do the sponsorship thing because, like I said, I'm fortunate to have a number of local businesses that sponsor me. Not the least of which is Yacht Club Soda, Rhode Island's original boutique soda. Boutique before there were boutique sodas. It's been in business over 100 years. This with continual ownership. It's Rhode Island based. It's right out of Centerdale. Folks, natural ingredients, spring water, their own aquifer. It is the official soda of the great state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. And so, if, for example, hypothetically, you're someone who's in sales all day and talks for 7 to 8 hours, and then you get on and you get to talk to great people on the radio and on TV and on the internet, and you continue to talk at a rate of 12 to 14 hours a day, you probably might start to get a sore throat. So right now, in honor of my new commitment to get back on the wagon, if you will, peach seltzer from Yacht Club Soda. Listen, yachtclubbottlingworks.com. It's available at Eastside Marketplace, right across the street here at Rogues Island, and at fine retailers everywhere. You're making a great dinner, you're having friends over, you're having cocktails, you're doing the farm to table thing, you're going all out. So why settle for the cheap crap in the plastic bottle when you can have, like I said, Rhode Island's original boutique soda? So Yacht Club Soda, for the next hour, I will be having a peach seltzer because, like I said, after 11 hours, the voice starts to go. But I want to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank all the folks who've been on tonight, Autumn, Emma, and Natalie. Again, articulate, clear vision, addressing a critical environment of social, not just social justice, but just basic human decency. Sex work has been with us forever. It will continue to be with us. It's a normal part of our biology. And for those folks who are not in a relationship, who are those folks who have needs, it's time we as a society accepted it, and certainly not in some twisted attempt to help individuals. We create, in our eyes, in our perception, and sadly sometimes in reality, we are the ones who are creating the victims. if in fact we incarcerate, we demonize, we marginalize an entire population, then who's really at fault? If we use these quote-unquote the bogeyman of trafficking, which is a serious issue, but if we create that and conflate that well beyond its scope, are we not, by creating this prohibition, this I'll call it sex work madness environment, are we not effectively creating more victims? And who's at fault? We are as a society, and we are as a nation. So joining me as our final guest for this show is Sarah. She is an academic, and she's going to bring to us really a slightly different perspective from her research. We'll get a little bit into the wonk side of this, and really give a forum for the truth, the facts. Or as one of my favorite philosophers of all time, Sergeant Friday, would say, "Just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts." Welcome to the coalition. This is quite the marathon we have going on right now, but I can think of no better way to spend an evening as we've done tonight. Thank you for helping me organize this too, as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to just shout out to everyone who has spoken before me, my wonderful peers and colleagues and fellow activists, and also people who haven't spoken tonight, but who are like part of our group, and we're all like, we're all very integral to the work that we do. We're all very collaborative with one each other and sharing. And I'm really nervous because these are some really hard acts to follow. Autumn and Natalie and Emma are just so on the ball. And I'll try my best, I suppose. You've opened up with talking about my bio as an academic, and so I'll just quickly go through that because I have a little bit of a journey to how I came to this subject. I'm originally a native of Massachusetts, and I moved to Belfast maybe about like 8 years ago or so, and I did my master's degree there, and as I was doing that, I started to become interested in like queer issues, and I started to become interested in feminism, and I started working with this activist, academic woman who was pretty big deal in Belfast. I think she still is, and she was actually an American as well, so I had this nice little affinity with her, and she was helping me put together some work around this issue and conduct some research. And she hails from what I would call, and what most of us would identify, including her, as part of the neo-abolitionist movement, abolition, much as in like the abolitionist movement of the 19th century. That's the abolishment of slavery. So there's actually like some similarities there in terms of the way that sex work is being framed, and it's very much framed as a form of modern slavery by people within this perspective. And over the course of my speaking to sex working women, primarily women at that time on the street, and even talking with police and talking with other service providers in Belfast, I really started to gain a different understanding of what was going on. It really didn't seem to match up with what she was telling me about, in terms of this depiction of sex work as a form of modern slavery, and sex work as a de facto form of exploitation that is always inherently violent and never chosen. And that's a pretty extreme view. And actually, I think that a lot of abolitionists these days have sort of changed that a little bit to sort of respond to the overwhelming fact that that is just not the case for a majority of women. So you see a little bit of pivoting these days on that. But yeah, eventually, I started to read, and I started to just really look around, and over time, I just realized, God, that really isn't it. And she and we had this fallout. I actually still have the emails of the back and forth where I'm just like, are you sure that blah, blah, blah? And she's like, yes. So it was kind of interesting. And I went on and did my PhD in sex work policy in Britain. So I can talk a little bit about, what sex work is like in Britain. if we want. I can also talk. I hope to talk a little bit tonight about allyship.
Right.
And sort of the responsibilities. I really focus very much when I talk to academics and when I talk to students on the responsibilities of academics to the sex working community. And meaning that can be summed up in give voice to the community, listen to them. So I can talk about that a bit.
Yeah. No, I'd love to get a perspective, a European perspective on this, because the traditional, the conventional wisdom, if you will, here in the United States is that the Europeans are so much more sophisticated about sexuality than Americans are. So give us a snapshot of what's worked, what hasn't worked in the current state of sex work in Western Europe, particularly England, and then a critical part of your organization and your relationship with SWAP, which is entirely outreach based to sex workers. You provide this ally component, which I find fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about both.
Great. Okay. Yeah. So, I think a good segue might be like what you were just saying a few minutes ago about how the state has really created sex workers as a class of victimized women in our society, and that's both in the discourse, the sort of ways in which we talk about sex workers, but it's also very much in the material effects and the material conditions and the lives that sex workers are living in their work and in their non-work and in just basically all aspects of their lives. We've heard all the speakers attest to that tonight, that it's just it really pervades the sense of your being. So we can go all the way back, at least in England, we can go all the way back to the Victorian era. And I believe that Natalie and Emma were talking about this earlier, how the vagrancy laws and the various ways in which women who were just sort of deviated a little bit from the sort of ideal middle class or upwardly mobile women were basically castigated and ostracized in all sorts of pernicious ways by the police. And you talked about producing people as victim, and really many of the features of the modern day, remarkably, many of the features of the modern day, are some of the features of the modern day sex industry that persist. For example, pimping, which is actually not as predominant, I think, as it was in the middle of the century, but it's still something that happens for some men and women. Those are products of laws. It was the case, the fact that somebody gets, the fact that we think of sex work as something that you are, sex work as something that you always are, that you are a sex worker, that it's embedded into your being, that is something that was created in Victorian England under the Contagious Diseases Act, which were essentially created in order to regulate the bodies of sex working women to make them safer so that the standing armies outside of major British cities were not spreading as much venereal disease amongst one another. So it was about making women's bodies available to men. That those acts essentially made women register as sex workers. This was never the case before these acts. These women would move in, and women in working class communities, this applies just to marriage as well as to sex work. They would move in and out of these types of occupations. They would move in and out of these types of relationships. These things were very fluid. And it was very much contingent on what people were doing to essentially manage the industrialization that they were experiencing at that time and the massive urban migration that women were experiencing at that time. And one of the ways in which women coped with all this economic dislocation is they formed brothels. So you would have women who would the sort of husband of the house was not in the picture for whatever reason, and there could be all sorts of reasons why that's the case. And you would have a woman who maybe had several children and she had a home. And so one of the things that she would do is young women who were coming into the city and couldn't get work right away, and maybe with sex work on the side, even on top of that, would rent rooms from her and essentially sell sex out of them. So you have this sort of madam relationship forming there, right? And those were generally in working class areas, and the police really didn't like all this, economic power that these groups of women were exercising within themselves. They were creating these really beautiful communities. I mean, I wish we could go back and like see them, and there's very little in the records. I will recommend a book at the end of this that listeners can go to learn more about this. But in order to sort of diffuse this remarkable power that these women were building up, they made it a law that women couldn't live by themselves in this way. And so suddenly all these women had to, that allowed them to sort of break up these brothels. And there were these women wandering the streets going, okay, well, now how do I sell sex? And started doing it on the street. So ergo, the state creates the street sex worker, okay? Mm-hmm. And on top of that, in order to, if they did want to sell sex from indoor premises, or if they wanted to protect themselves from the constant police interference, what else did women do? They went and got a man. They went and got a pimp. So you were talking earlier about how, the law produces people and their conditions. And, these are features of the industry that persist in certain ways and in certain areas to these days, and certainly persist in our imagination. And these are products of our society. In the book where you can find this really well documented, I can't remember the name of it, but it's by Judith Walkowitz, Walkowitz. Mm-hmm. And really since that time, and there's been a lot of really remarkable historical work done in recent years on all these times, but since then there's been a lot of changes in Britain, and essentially the situation that the UK now finds itself in is a situation, or the UK sex worker community, I should say, mm-hmm. is a situation of partial criminalization. So in the mid-20th century, lawmakers agreed on actually libertarian grounds that the state had no right to interfere with the private lives of its citizenry. But if those private lives spilled over into the so-called public sphere, then the state did have a right to interfere. And so what that has meant is that that sex work in the UK is not criminalized per se in itself. So you can sell sex and you can never be imprisoned or fined or convicted or get in any trouble with the state for just doing that, for just that transaction, for buying or selling. But there's all sorts of things around the sex industry that have been criminalized. So, for example, curbside soliciting, advertising. There's all sorts of brothel keeping bylaws. And in recent years, some of the legislation that's come in around trafficking has, as all our speakers tonight have attested to, conflated adult sex work with trafficking or with child sexual exploitation, which is the prostitution of minors, has kind of pulled all those things together and created some legislation that doesn't necessarily negate or doesn't necessarily criminalize the selling of sex, but has made it much harder across the board for adult women and men to sell sex without sort of putting themselves at risk. For example, one of these laws most recently passed, it's in the 2009 Policing and Crime Act, and it's called the Strict Liability Clause, and it was put in just a number of years ago, 2009, all right? And what this clause does is it says you as a purchaser of sexual services, you have to make sure that that there are no third-party beneficiaries or third-party coercers of the person that you are buying sex from, all right? And that is ridiculous because it essentially means that if you find out about that, say if you ask before or after, you will then be criminally liable for the very thing that you might be finding out about. And interestingly, the police of the national, basically the police in London and police throughout England, none of them have used this law because they were finding that in order to, attain information and intelligence from punters about the possibility of someone being trafficked or coerced, they can't prosecute them. So it's a law of disrepute, and it's still on the books, which is ridiculous. But that is the type of product that we see from the sort of neo-abolitionist logic that has started to come to fore in Britain in recent years, but again, hasn't taken complete grip yet. So, do you have any? Sorry, I'm
No, no,
rambling. So let me know if you have any questions.
Yeah, no, I wanted to point out the irony, and this is whether it be the American laws or the English laws, that very often it's almost, and I say almost because I want to be respectful here of some of the implications of being found guilty, but the English are almost following the American tradition, if you will, is that by charging someone or having a law that you can charge someone with, number one, drives the practice underground, and number two, the age-old question, how do I get my reputation back, even if you're charged and then the charges are dropped? Because ultimately, particularly if you're I love the English term punter, but if you're the if you're the John, as we say in the United States, or if you're the punter.
Yeah, John client.
Right. It's the gun at their head, if you will, is the threat of exposure, because society frowns on this type of relationship, and so by creating laws, enforceable or not, by allowing them to be on the books, the economic violence continues, because ultimately, and unless we can somehow get over these obstacles and accept it for what it is, which is, again, it's a monetarily driven consensual relationship, all right, then there's always going to be the need to hide. And when people have to hide, that's when criminality increases exponentially, real criminality. And what I mean by real criminality is the pimps, the beatings, the trafficking, because it's just a simple economic fact of life. If you can buy it illegally at a reasonable price, any product, whether it be sex, whether it be drugs, heck, whether it be a good roast beef, if you can buy it, if you can buy it
well,
legally,
sure, there's black markets for all sorts of things. It just depends what's outlawed.
Right. So, buy it legally, you introduce a free market, and competition and safety.
What sociologists, so we're really only in about, really, the regulation of the sex industry and of the commercial sex sector, we're only in less than the second century of that. It's only been less than 200 years since any country in the world has really started to regulate these in a prohibitive way. Okay, so one of the things that sociologists are starting to who study this are starting to recognize is that you bring in a new set of repressive laws, and then usually what happens is the industry might sort of shrink for slightly, or sort of pull back or go underground a bit, and then it just bounces back within a couple years. So we're seeing the exact same thing in Sweden right now. So if I could just I'll speak to something that ties into what you're speaking about right now, which is what happens when you when you put in laws, when you exacerbate or sort of amplify prohibition, and the result of that, which is for people to go underground. So there's a legal model along the variation of what I would call demand side prohibition. So traditionally, a lot of laws, a lot of the kind of criminalization of sex work has largely focused on the seller of sex, and now it's starting to focus on the demand side. And there is a sort of initially intuitive feminist logic to this, the women are entering in conditions of unfreedom, presumably the men are not, and therefore we should criminalize them. And I think that actually I love it when Emma talks about her clients and her stories, and I think that that's really powerful, because we have really, really reductive views of clients, of punters, of Johns. And I think that the few statistics that we do have tend to show that this is not a violent population, that it's not even necessarily a population of working class men or of just middle class men. It's incredibly varied. It's not even necessarily married or unmarried. It's just a varied population. It's just like any cross section of a population. It's people who are looking for a particular type of intimacy or sexual experience, and you guys talked beautifully about that earlier, so I'm not going to rehash that now. But yeah, the reviews tend to be really reductive, and more recently, the Swedish model has adopted this demand-side prohibition ethos, and the idea there is we will, criminalize the buyer, the man, presumably, as if women don't buy sex either, which is not true. It's certainly not as great as men, but it's not true. And what we're finding, so that those laws were put in maybe about 12 years ago or so, and so some of the first sort of longitudinal studies are coming out. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence at first. And what we're finding is that initially, the sex industry kind of, shrank, and a lot of people moved just abroad to Norway, and then they put in some similar model too, and sort of the same thing happened. But now we're seeing things bounce back, except women and men who are in this sector need to protect their income. What has not changed, in fact, what has probably become worse, is the difficulties of living in late capitalism, which are essentially precarious, which are by design precarious, which are by design interested in criminalizing particular surplus populations, to use the Marxist term, right? Like the people who are a little bit expendable right now. So, sorry, go on.
No, it's just frustrating to see, because it's become predictable at this point. What ultimately the reaction is going to be.
I mean, we live in truly garish times. Like, we really do. Like it's abysmal. It's abysmal, because it is so hard to survive these days. And by the way, I'm speaking as a non-sex worker. It is so hard to survive. I'm an adjunct professor. I am like this super highly educated person, and I make like $17,000 a year. And like, trying to break into academia has literally, it's exhausting, and it's disheartening, and it's just been nothing but a slog. Like, so, somebody, at least I have, something to lean on. There are lots of people who don't. There are some people who still have that and will still go into the sex industry.
Right.
But it's very weird that we live in this world where capitalism makes it so hard for us to survive, and then punishes people who are surviving in it, or just trying to, glean from their existence some semblance of comfort,
Well, probably where you and I would disagree is I'm going to add a word to the front of capitalism and say crony capitalism. As a libertarian, and that's because the real challenge is that when capitalism is perverted so badly in the interest of an individual group. And again, I look at, ironically, there's a lot of people profiting greatly off of sex work. None of them, or very few of them, are actual sex workers. It's the people who have used their connections to an overarching government to profit from the prohibition of sex work. And whether it be the government itself, whether it be vested interests, you look at each, the trifecta, if you will, of prohibited enterprises, and clearly drugs, prostitution / sex work, and then of course in the 20th century you had alcohol, and it engendered a great deal of profits for some very predictable people, and those are the people who were able to use their governmental or extra governmental connections to control and monopolize the continuing usage of alcohol, sex work, or drugs, because ultimately the demand never really changes that greatly when it's looked at over a protracted period of time. You're right in that sense, it's bumped around a little bit. It may be squeezed here, squeezed there, a little bit of whack-a-mole, but ultimately you're looking at people who are acting quote unquote in society's best interest, but who are nothing more than monopolists who want to control the source of income that can be derived from the existence of a particular activity. In this case, it's illicit, it's illegal. They figured out an angle, how to make money off it. It's
Yeah,
disgusting.
and so actually, I could maybe sort of speak to that kind of crony aspect within the commercial sex sector in the example of the Netherlands. So there we have an example of a legal model of legalization. And by the way, these are very different. Legalization is something that we in the movement consider very different than decriminalization. Because what is implied in legalization, at least as we understand it, is that there's some kind of interventionist regulation in the lives of the sex workers or in like the sort of industry itself that sort of seems to supersede just the basic sort of like zoning practices of businesses like going somewhere. Although some zoning practices can be very pernicious towards sex workers as well. But setting that aside as its own thing. What happened in the Netherlands a couple decades ago, the late 80s, early 90s, when the sex work industry was completely legalized, and all the different stakeholders that came together to basically and essentially, hash out exactly what this policy would be and how it would work. It was not the sex workers, or at least not as a community, maybe a few individuals, who were at the table during those discussions.
Right.
It was the brothel keepers. It was the policymakers. It was all these other, stakeholders, but stakeholders with differential sort of powers, people who had a sort of vested interest in making monopolies in the sex industry something that could sort of work for them and their profit. Or at least not interfere with or be too much of a drag on the state, right? So those were the interests that were aligned in those policy discussions. And that can be contrasted with the only place in the world where actual decriminalization has happened, and which I would say, which is New Zealand. And when that policies were being implemented in the early 90s in New Zealand, the decrim policy, sex workers as activists, as a community, and as individuals were part of those discussions. Okay, they were given a seat at the table, and that is an imperative. And you don't really see that anywhere else in the world. And just as a side note, sex work is also decriminalized in the Victoria, Australia, but it's actually more legalized. There's a little bit more interventionist stuff going on there than I think there is in New Zealand. So there are some differences there. But I think the main difference for me, and probably why the model works so well in New Zealand, and the data coming out of there is really overwhelmingly, it shows that the qualitative, working conditions of sex workers have vastly improved. And I think that this goes down to the fact that sex workers were at the table. Well, come on.
But you see, it's interesting because you've actually endorsed a very libertarian concept, and let me explain this in the light of what's happening here in Rhode Island, for example, with the legalization of cannabis. There's decriminalization, and there's legalization with regulation, and then there's true legalization. You have three different examples. I believe you folks, the sex worker community, seek decriminalization because they want the absence of an overarching regulation which would then serve to perform effectively the same type of, or impose the same type of societal constraints and the same type of marginalization that pre-criminalization effectively enforces because of society's obsession with sex, particularly here in the United States, and associating with a quote unquote, their words not mine, prurient/defective character. Now, if you had true legalization without regulation, that effectively would be decriminalization without the notion that you have to register. We had a situation here, and it was interesting, caused a great deal of controversy in the libertarian movement last year, because we were endorsing a legislation that would have legalized cannabis, but it would have heavily regulated it. And we're kind of a new movement here, and we were just all on board because it's legalizing, and we didn't read the fine print. And then one day, our vice chairman and our policy guy read the fine print, and we had our rut-row moment because we realized that the gross invasion of privacy, the gross abrogation of the Fourth Amendment and First Amendment overwhelmed any benefit from the, and I'll use air quotes, legalization, because it was legalization with regulation. And that's not liberty, that's not freedom, that's not solving the issue or the problems that prohibition occurs. All that does is give government a voice in articulating the same type of problems that you get with the criminalization. But I understand fundamentally why you need it to be decriminalized and not legalized, because society will inject themselves. They'll use, and feel free to challenge me on this, but they'll use the usual stuff, the zoning issues, as you mentioned. They'll use healthcare issues. Their quote unquote interest in the healthcare of the sex worker will be their way for them to essentially regulate and to monitor the participation of those involved in it, and then attempt to marginalize them through other methods.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, actually, that's one of the things that I studied in Britain, and I interviewed a lot of social workers and healthcare workers who worked in public health focused organizations. And amongst the organizations that specialized in working with sex workers or with queer populations and trans populations, they were much more sort of open and like less sort of pushy about trying to get people and encourage people to engage in good sexual health practices. Mm-hmm. But their commissioning standards were very strict, and as organizations they had to balance that, and I think it was really hard for them, and sometimes that really didn't work out for them or particular individuals or for the organization. But the thing is though is like sex workers want to use safe sex. It's not like something that like the government needs to be like telling sex workers. Of course they want to be healthy. Like what? Like no. Like of course they don't want to acquire or pass on STDs. And in fact, actually, I think there has actually been data which shows that the rates of HIV transmission and other sexually transmitted diseases are much lower within sex working communities than the population at large. These are people who understand what is at risk here. I mean, it's not like something that the government needs to be telling them. They're the ones who in the 80s were asking, along with the LGBT movement, to be recognized and to make sure that and to have health care and to have the means of protecting and taking care of themselves. So it's really, it's this very condescending, patronizing paternalism that sometimes kicks in around there too. And that is one of the fears. Yeah, that is absolutely one of the fears around, leaving any sort of inroad for state intervention in the sex working community. Sex workers are interested, sex workers are interested in being able to democratically organize themselves. Mm-hmm. and in concert also with other communities that intersect with them and their issues. These are perfectly capable people. And unfortunately, one of the problems is, and this is something that I have it's basically the main theme of my work, a lot of the organizations that are out there that are supposedly supposed to be empowering sex workers, okay, some of them more health-based, some of them more social services-based, some of them, religious. Mm-hmm. The ones that are supposed to be empowering sex workers really just focus on individual needs. And they don't focus on trying to, help sex workers build up their political agency and their political communities and actually, address the conditions that of their workplace, okay, their wide workplace that are shaped by much larger social trends than something that can be fixed with a condom. There are bigger issues. Sex workers have that down. There are bigger things that need to be dealt with. And so that is definitely something that as an ally, I try to emphasize that these are men and women and trans people who have a voice, and it's often not lifted up enough. And I am reminded of Natalie was saying earlier about how, for a long time there were actual academics who were like, I don't talk to sex working women because they're products of false consciousness and they don't understand the situation that they're in. Or they would look at somebody who was like, maybe somebody like Emma, and they would say, oh, she's like, operating from the golden standard of positionality. What does she actually know about the actual sex industry? And these are just like the most awful patronizing things to say ever. And it was really just a way for those types of academics to just, not like to be lazy, I think, and to not confront like their own internal biases. And the fact like I had to when I was starting to learn about this stuff. And it was really uncomfortable to realize that as a freaking like suburban white girl from, North Shore of Massachusetts, that like I had to come, like it was hard to sort of like get out of my head. But once I did, boy, I found it so much more liberating to recognize how much more complex the world is and how much more beautiful it is because of that. And so part of being an ally, I was just hoping I could talk about that before we close out, because I know we only have a few minutes.
Right. I just wanted to point out one thing. The power.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No,
I'm a rambler.
No, that's why this has been great. Power exchange is a very loaded concept in the world of sexuality. But clearly, there's a power exchange that needs to take place between these people who have sort of lorded over sex workers through their own feeling of self-imposed superiority, whether they, moral, intellectual, or whatever, all fraudulently, I might add. There needs to be a power exchange between the alleged stakeholders and the people who really, for lack of a better term, this is a horrible pun, but really who have skin in the game, and the people who have the real vested interest, who need to have power transferred to them, are folks in your community and the folks that you work alongside of so ably. So I mean that's ultimately was to have to happen, but there's a whole set of dire economic and social circumstances that will accrue to those people who finally give up power, that they probably aren't really interested in. And so I feel like, and I have a feeling you are on the same boat on this, that you're going to, what's the historical term, wrest power, i.e. grab it from them, kicking and screaming. Because there's no real interest in any of the people that we've talked about tonight: government, the churches, the NGOs, the police, the political side of law enforcement. There is absolutely not a single whit of interest in that group on giving up any power whatsoever, is there?
Oh my God, no! They're so invested in upholding their professional class.
Right.
And it's such a shame because like so much of the feminist movement has completely fallen into that trap.
Right.
And I think that now what is happening, and I think that the sex workers' rights movement, which is really starting to gain steam, is an indicator of this. I think that there's a generation of young feminists, many of them much more informed by queer theory than their predecessors, who are really interested in trying to have a more complex look at how institutions have essentially eroded freedom, have exacerbated oppression, and have made it in many ways harder to be a fully fledged woman, to be like what you were saying earlier, to be like a flipping human, who is just like open and changing and trying to and experimenting and figuring things out for herself, and doesn't necessarily want to be put in a box all the time, and doesn't and power has works in these really insidious ways, and I think I have like the utmost love and really a lot of respect for sort of early feminists. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir is my girl, but they really were. They weren't looking at they were looking at the boot on the face, but they weren't looking at the ways in which we are our own boots on our own faces, and how we become complicit in our own oppression through the types of categories that we deploy and employ when we're trying to interact with one another and explain things, and a big part of allyship and why the sort of skill of active listening and the virtues of patience and humility are so important is that and I say this especially as someone who is privileged on many identity axes, that like you have to really set yourself aside and try and understand and just sort of be kind of, let that complexity wash over you and let somebody tell their story and talk with them and be courageous to talk with them too. I mean, we've had some really like in-depth like conversations, in our groups and things haven't always been easy and things haven't always, like things like nothing like I mean, his activism ever easy, but no. I mean, I think this is a problem, like or not a problem, but this is a real task before the left right now. It's one I'm thinking about all the time, and I'm trying to work on it. And so I don't really have fully formulated thoughts at the moment, but I think that people get really caught up in guilt. I think people get really caught up in PC language. I think that people really get caught up in their immediate feelings of comfort and discomfort, and don't just try to embrace the very uncomfortable complexity of people around them and try to be patient and understand where people are coming from and listen to their stories and then try and walk away and go, okay, like it's different than my story, but here's where we come together. And for me with sex work, as Natalie has pointed out, like the Madonna whore dichotomy, like the fact that there are these women who are like these wonderful mothers and we should all worship them, and then there's this whole other class of women who are bad and naughty, like the whores, like that oppresses all women. I mean, as a young student who attended like a conservative Catholic college and was like openly having sex all the time on campus, like I was castigated to the umpteenth degree. Now, I wasn't a sex worker, but I knew what it felt like to be defined by like a sort of preordained category of femininity and to be like treated as such as that. And so we have to smash that dichotomy. And so for me, like the sex working movement is like one of the most important movements of feminism. And I'm so glad to see it on the agenda for so many young feminists these days.
Excellent. Well, we're just about out of time, but again, I mean, first of all, thank you for your assistance in organizing this tonight, and thank you to all of you for participating and having this conversation. This was wonderful. It's a difficult, challenging time. It's a difficult, challenging issue, but the fact that we could have this kind of conversation, I think, speaks very well to the concept of independent media and the type of platform.
Yeah.
Tell folks how they can find you on the web.
Sure, yeah, so let me do some plugs. So it's www.massachusettswan.org. So it's Massachusetts with the S and then Swan also with the S, like the bird. So www.massachusettsswan.org. And our Twitter is @MassSwan. And again, MASS Swan, SWAN. So @MassSWAN.
Right. And you've got a great website. I know you updated it with, I think, just in the last couple of days with one of the speeches you were alluding to earlier. Please, we're going to continue the conversation. Please include us. If you've got events coming up, if you've got white papers or treatises or press releases or things that you want to get out to a larger medium.
And anyone can contact us on our website. You can just go there. There's like a contact form. So if anyone has questions or, I don't know, they just want to contact us for whatever reason, please do.
Yeah, and I want to point out this is particularly important for people who are involved in sex work, male, female, trans, whatever your particular station in life is. If you're involved in sex work, your organization exists to provide a level of caring, support, empathy, on a number of different levels for folks who find themselves alone, as quite frankly the powers that be would attempt to continue to do. So minus the judgment, minus the guilt, a lot of fellow travelers who can provide a perspective and give you kind of a it's okay kind of affirmation that might be missing from your life right now. So I want to put that out there as well.
And can I just say that if you are a sex worker and you want to contact SWAP or MASWAN, please don't shy away from trying to take security measures to protect yourself. to use a different name than your real name, to use different email addresses than your real email address, et cetera, please do not hesitate to do that.
No, absolutely. It's understood as part of the communication. It's I won't even say in a sense it's tragic. It is tragic that we have to all have this conversation, under the radar, if you will. But, well, tonight we didn't, though, did we?
Thank you.
This is
Thank you for that. Yeah, you made that possible. Thank you.
No, and again, we'll get this up as soon as we can on the website. And again, thank you. Best of luck with your cause. And there is an entire community of people out there who are ready to support folks in whatever your next step is. You just have to let us know.
Thank you.
Well, thank
Take
you.
care, Pat.
All right, folks. We are the Coalition, a loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network, here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. It's been a hell of a night. Real-world introspection, real-world discussion, real-world analysis, real-world facts about one of the most challenging issues of our time. And of course, we're talking about sex work. On a societal level, on a criminal level, on a behavioral level, it's all there. But we are complex beings. And it's time, as a society, as a body politic, that we start to look at complex issues and address them in a forthright, cogent manner, as opposed to the type of nonsense that constantly pervades what we call government here, both in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New England, and the country at large. CoalitionRadio.us, Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, and as always, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. Please follow us on Twitter. Please take a moment to like us on Facebook. And again, sign up on our site where we're finally making some moves to activate our email list so that we can continue to communicate to you, bring you new ideas, and engage in outrage porn, civilly disobedient media. Folks, stay tuned. We'll be back next week. Next week, hopefully we're going to finally have that Right to Try show. Folks, national and local experts are going to talk about Right to Try. You can do a little pre-show research at www.righttotry.org. Folks, take it personally. We'll be back.